Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day you've just come through, you have arrived at the quiet part of it. Dim your screen, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, let the room around you get a little softer at the edges. You do not have to follow every word tonight. You do not have to remember any of it. The only thing you need to do is breathe slowly and let the story carry you down. Before we begin, tonight's episode comes to us from a listener named MPM12. Thank you, this one is yours. And if you're listening on Spotify, then you have about 10 seconds to spare before you drift off. A review helps more than you would think. It is the single easiest way to help this channel reach the next person who cannot sleep tonight. Now, let us begin where the story begins, in total darkness, underground, with a man whispering into a small plastic recorder because he is too afraid to speak out loud. There is a sound on that recording, we will get to it. The cave is somewhere in the mountains northwest of Kandahar, in the spring of 2002. The recording begins with nothing but breathing. Controlled breathing. The kind a soldier is trained to do when his heart is going faster than he wants it to, and he needs to bring it back down. In the background there is the shuffle of boots over loose stone, careful, deliberate. The sound of men trying very hard not to make sound. They have been searching for almost 6 hours. They are looking for 6 other men who walked into this valley and did not walk back out. The voice on the recorder is low. He is describing what he sees for the benefit of whoever finds this later, which is in itself a strange thing for a soldier to do. It means that some part of him has already accepted that he might not be the one to deliver the report. He says the passage narrows. He says the air is warmer than it should be this far into a mountain. He says there is a smell. He tries to describe the smell and cannot quite do it. He says it is like rotting meat. Then he corrects himself and says it is like a butcher shop that lost power in the summer. Then he corrects himself again and says there is something under that. Wet animal hide. Old smoke. Something with a sourness to it that he has no word for at all. You can hear another man ahead of him say a single word that the microphone does not catch cleanly. Then a light moves across the far wall of the cavern. At the edge of that light there is a shape. The soldier describes it, in a voice that has flattened out into pure professional calm as a pile of hides, a heap of cloth and skins stacked against the rock. He's already moving his light past it toward the passages beyond. And then, on the recording, you hear the moment the story stops being a search and becomes something else. The pile stands up. What follows on the audio is a sound that has been described by everyone who claims to have heard it in almost exactly the same way, and the consistency of that description is one of the reasons the legend survived. They say it did not sound like an animal. Animals have a range you recognise. A bear, a big cat, a wounded dog. This was lower than that, and longer, and it had shape inside it, the way a shout has shape. It was closer to a voice than a roar, and that is the part that makes people uncomfortable when they talk about it, because a voice implies a throat built for language. Then the gunfire starts. The microphone cannot handle it. Automatic fire in an enclosed stone chamber is not a series of cracks, it is a solid wall of distortion, and the recording turns to static for several seconds at a time. Between those walls of noise there are fragments of men shouting over each other. Someone shouts that it is still moving, someone shouts a range correction, and the number he gives is so small that it means the thing is nearly on top of them. Someone shouts a warning about the ceiling, and then, in a gap between bursts, in a voice that has gone up into a register that no training prepares you for, one of them shouts 4 words that became the centre of the entire legend. He shouts that it has a spear. The recording continues for 11 more seconds. There is one more burst of fire. There is a sound like a heavy sack of sand being swung into a wall. There is an impact loud enough that the microphone element overloads and produces nothing but a dead flat tone. And then the recorder stops. That is the whole of it. That is the artifact at the heart of the story. Less than 4 minutes of audio, most of it distortion, recovered years later from a dead man's belongings and handed to a stranger by a widow who wanted someone to tell her whether her husband had been insane. The rest of this story is the answer to her question. To understand how 6 men could vanish inside a country full of satellites and radios and aircraft, you have to understand what southern Afghanistan actually looked like in the spring of 2002. The war was young, only a few months old. The maps that the American military carried into those mountains were, in many places, older than the men reading them. Some of them were Soviet, some of them were British, redrawn and photocopied and redrawn again until the contour lines had softened into suggestions. There were valleys in that country that had not been meaningfully surveyed by any outside power in living memory, and there were villages that had not seen a foreign soldier since the 1980s, and there were mountain systems where the rock is so folded and so old that a cave mouth 30 feet wide can sit invisible from the air, tucked under an overhang in shadow for 23 hours of the day. That is the landscape. Enormous, vertical, ancient and full of holes. Now put a 6-man reconnaissance patrol into it. The patrol is army. Their assignment on paper is unremarkable. They are to move northwest of Kandahar into a valley that the intelligence summaries describe as a possible transit route for weapons moving out of the mountains. They are to observe. They are to map. They are to note any structures, any caves, any signs of recent human traffic. They are not to engage unless engaged. That is the official version, and there is nothing suspicious about it. Patrols like that went out every day of that war and came back sunburned and bored and full of complaints about their feet. The unofficial version, which surfaces later in the telling of this story, is that the valley had already produced a small file of unexplained disappearances. Not soldiers, locals, herders who went up with animals in the spring and did not come down. A boy who was sent to find a lost goat and was never found himself. A pair of men from a village on the eastern slope who went up to check a water source and left behind 2 pairs of sandals at the edge of a stream, side by side, as though they had stepped out of them voluntarily. None of that would have made it into an American intelligence summary in 2002. That kind of thing is not a security concern. It is a local tragedy in a country that had been producing local tragedies for 23 years, without interruption. But it made it into the mouths of the interpreters, and the interpreters talked. The valley had a name. In the reports it is rendered, imperfectly, as Dara Yi Sork, the Red Valley. The men who wrote it down assumed the name referred to the soil, because in that part of the country the soil often does have an iron red cast to it, especially in the late afternoon when the light comes in sideways and every slope looks like rust. The interpreters said no. The name was older than that. The name did not refer to the ground. It referred to what was said to live in it. That is the first small wrongness in this story, and I want you to notice how small it is, because the whole legend is built out of small wrongnesses stacked carefully on top of each other. Nobody says anything impossible at the beginning. Somebody just gets a translation slightly wrong, and a guide refuses to walk after dark, and a valley has an old name that nobody bothers to look into. The patrol goes in at first light. Their initial check-in comes shortly after dawn, and it is entirely routine. Weather clear, visibility good, no enemy contact. They give their position, they give their intended line of march, and they mention that they are moving toward a suspected cave complex on the northern wall of the valley. The radio operator on the other end writes it down and thinks nothing of it. Cave complexes were the whole war that spring. Everybody was looking for cave complexes. The second transmission comes roughly 3 hours later. It is not routine. The first thing the receiving station notices is that the signal quality has collapsed. That in itself is not alarming in that terrain, where a single ridge can eat a transmission hole. But the second thing they notice is the operator's voice. He is not panicked. He is not shouting. He is doing something worse than that. He is being extremely careful. He is speaking slowly and clearly, the way people speak when they have decided that the most important thing in the world is that this message be understood correctly the first time, because there may not be a second time. He reports that they have located the cave complex. He reports that they have found equipment outside it, and he starts listing it, and the list is what makes the transmission strange. He describes military equipment from more than one era. He describes webbing and canvas that is clearly not modern. He mentions a helmet. He mentions a boot with a sole pattern he does not recognise. He says there is metal that has been in the weather for a very long time. He reports human remains, not bodies, remains. He is specific about that distinction, and the specificity is horrible. He reports tracks in the softer ground near the entrance, and this is where the transmission begins to break up badly. The receiving station gets fragments. Something about size. Something about the distance between them. A word that some listeners later insisted was impossible, and others insisted was simply garbled. He reports that the cave entrance appears to have been partially sealed with stones, and that the stones have been moved recently. Then there is a gap of perhaps 8 seconds where the carrier is open and nobody speaks, just static, and underneath it the flat empty hiss of a mountainside. And then the operator says the last thing anyone in the American military ever hears from that patrol. It is 4 words. They are the 4 words that took this from a missing persons case to a legend, because they are the sound of a trained man realising that his entire threat model is wrong. He says that this is not Taliban. Then the signal ends, not degrades. Ends. Nothing further is received from that patrol. Not that hour, not that day, not ever. What happens next is, depending on which version of this story you believe, either completely normal military bureaucracy or the exact moment the cover-up begins. The patrol is initially listed as delayed. That is not sinister. Patrols were delayed constantly. Terrain slowed people down. Weather closed in. Radios failed for 100 boring reasons. A unit that misses a check-in is not a crisis for the first several hours. It is paperwork with a slightly worried tone. By nightfall, the tone has changed. A recovery operation is formally requested, and the request is denied. The reason given is that aerial surveillance shows no sign of the men, no sign of a firefight, no thermal returns in the area of the last known position, and that a night insertion into unmapped mountain terrain carries more risk than the situation currently justifies. That is a defensible decision on its face. Any officer could sign that and sleep fine. But here is the part that people who tell this story always circle back to. Surveillance showing nothing is not the same as surveillance showing they're gone. If 6 men had been ambushed, there would be something. Burn marks. Scattered equipment visible from above, bodies in the open, vehicles that stopped moving. A firefight in a valley leaves a signature the way a fire leaves a scar. There was none of that. There was simply an absence in a place where 6 men had been that morning. The following dawn, a directive arrives ordering an immediate ground search, and this is where the paperwork gets strange for the first time. The directive does not come down through the regional command structure. It does not follow the path that an order like that would normally follow, from the theatre commander down through the chain to the units on the ground. It arrives laterally, from an office in Washington, and in every surviving version of the document that anyone claims to have seen, the name of that office has been redacted, not the content. The content is intact, just the letterhead. Somebody in the United States knew about this before the people in Afghanistan had finished filling out the missing personnel forms. The team sent in is not another reconnaissance patrol. It is a special operations element, and it is inserted several miles from the missing patrol's last known coordinates rather than directly on top of them, which is itself a decision worth noticing. You do not stand off from a rescue, you stand off from a target. In the telling, the team is small. The names that circulate in the story are these, and I will say plainly that none of them have ever been verified against any personnel record, because a great deal of this story is a set of names that only exist inside the story. A mission commander called Captain Noah Vale, a weapons specialist called Sergeant Marcus Reddick, a communications specialist called Corporal Ian Mercer, a medic called Staff Sergeant Dorian Pike, 3 additional operators whose names never appear, and an Afghan interpreter called Farid Azami, a man in his early 30s from a village 2 valleys east, who had been working with American units since December, and who was, by every account in this story, the only person on that mountain. who was not surprised by anything that happened. Their orders are read to them on the aircraft. Locate the missing patrol. Recover all equipment. Avoid direct engagement unless necessary. Vale notices the order of those 3 lines immediately, and it stays with him for the rest of his life. Recover all equipment appears before any language about personnel. In a rescue, you go for the men. Equipment is what you sweep up afterward if you have time. Somebody had written this order caring more about what the patrol was carrying or what the patrol had found than about the patrol. He does not raise it. You do not raise things like that on an aircraft with the ramp already down. They insert at last light and move through the night. The valley, when they reach it, is not what any of them expected. It is quiet in a way that mountains are usually not quiet. No birds, no goats, no dogs barking from a settlement 3 miles away, which is a sound that carries in that country and that you learn to use as a map. Nothing. Just wind coming down off the high ground and the sound of their own gear. Farid does not like it. He says so, once, quietly, and then he stops talking. They find the patrol's last position shortly after sunrise, and the campsite is the moment when everyone on that team understands that they are not going to find 6 men sitting on rocks with a broken radio, embarrassed and thirsty. Nothing has been taken. That is the wrongness. In that country, in that year, an abandoned American position would be stripped inside a day. Weapons were currency. Optics were currency. Radios, batteries, boots, food, ammunition, all of it had a price and all of it moved fast. If insurgents had overrun a patrol, there would be nothing left but wrappers and shell casings. Instead, the team walks into a camp that looks like the men have stepped away for 10 minutes. Rifles are stacked near the rocks, not thrown down, stacked, the way you stack them when you're settling in. One of them still has a magazine seated and the safety on. A radio lies on the ground with its handset a few feet away, as though it had been dropped mid-transmission and nobody had come back for it. Rations are open but not finished. There is a packet of coffee powder that has spilled across a flat stone and been rained on, and dried again into a dark crust. There is blood on one sleeping mat. A significant amount of it. It has soaked through and stained the ground underneath, and there is a trail of it leading away from the mat for about 4 meters before it stops. Not thins out, stops, cleanly, as though whatever was bleeding had been lifted. And around the perimeter of the camp, pressed into the softer soil near the waterline, there are impressions. Reddick finds them first and does not say anything for a long moment. He's not a man who is prone to drama. He kneels next to one and puts his own boot beside it for comparison, and then he calls Vale over without raising his voice. The impression is nearly twice the length of a size 11 combat boot. It is not a boot print. There is no tread. There is a broad, flat pad, a deep heel, and then, at the front, distinct separated toe impressions, 5 of them, pressed deep where the weight rolled forward. Except that Reddick counts them twice, and then a third time, and the count does not change. He counts 6. And the stride between one impression and the next is the detail that no one on the team can explain away, because you can fake a footprint. Men have faked footprints for centuries. What you cannot easily fake, especially over uneven rocky ground where the prints appear and disappear according to where the soil will take them, is a consistent walking stride of nearly 2.5 meters, laid down casually, without any sign of leaping or running. That is not a man in costume shoes. That is something that walks. Farid looks at the prints for a very short time. Then he walks back toward the equipment and asks Vale, in a level and reasonable voice, whether they can leave now. Vale asks him what he thinks made the prints, and Farid, who has spent 5 months translating for Americans and has learned exactly how much strangeness they will tolerate before they stop listening to you, gives an answer that he has clearly been deciding whether to give since they landed. He says that there are old people in the high places, not old men. Old people, a separate kind. He uses a phrase that the team writes down phonetically in 3 different ways, and that gets rendered in the story, ever after, as the first sons. He says they lived up here before ordinary men came into the region. He says the villagers have rules about them that are not really superstitions, the way we would use the word, but closer to municipal regulations. You do not graze animals above a certain line on this particular slope. You do not camp in the valley after sunset. If you find a cave that has been closed with stones, you leave it closed, and you do not tell anyone where it is, because someone will always go and open it. He says that his grandmother's brother went up the eastern slope in the 1960s and came back down without his hearing and without any explanation, and lived another 20 years and never once went above the tree line again. Vale asks him, because he has to, whether he believes it. Fareed says that what he believes does not matter. He says the prints are there, and either they were made by something or they were not, and the Americans are welcome to decide which. They go up. The trail climbs for most of the morning, and it is a trail, that is the thing. Not a goat path. There is a route through the scree that has been used enough to compact it, switching back and forth up the face in a line that a hydrologist would call efficient. Somebody has been walking this for a very long time, near the top of a narrow ridge, tucked under an overhang that would render it invisible to anything looking down from above. They find the cave. The entrance has been partially blocked by a rockfall, and after 10 minutes of looking at it, Pike says out loud what they are all thinking, which is that the rockfall is wrong. Rock comes down from above and spreads out. This rock has been placed. The larger stones are at the bottom, the smaller fill is on top, and the whole arrangement is stacked against the opening rather than fallen across it. It is a wall, built by something that could lift stones that a two-man team could not shift together, and a section of that wall has been dismantled from the inside. Outside the entrance, scattered across a fan of loose ground, there are bones. This is the part of the story where people usually stop being able to hear it as an adventure, so let me tell it plainly and then move past it. The bones are human. Some of them are recent enough to still be discoloured rather than white. Others are heavily mineralised, stained the same rust colour as the rock around them, so old that they have started to become part of the mountain. They are not laid out. They have been discarded in the way that any predator discards, in a rough arc at the distance a thing can throw. Among them the team finds artefacts, and the artefacts are the reason this story has legs. A helmet from the Soviet-Afghan War, steel, the paint gone, the liner rotted out of it entirely. Farther in, a rusted ammunition tin with British markings, of a pattern that would place it somewhere in the second half of the 19th century, from the era when the British Empire was sending columns into these mountains and having them not come back. And under an overhanging slab, a corroded iron spearhead of no design anyone on the team recognises at all. You do not need a laboratory to read that. 4 different armies, spread across something like 150 years, and every one of them left something in the same debris field outside the same hole in the same mountain. Whatever is inside has been eating for a long time. They go in anyway, and I want to say clearly that this is not a criticism. 6 of their own were in there. There was no version of that morning where those men turned around. The passage runs back into the rock for perhaps 40 metres before it opens out, and the smell increases with every step, and the temperature climbs, and Mercer notes on the recorder that there is airflow, meaning there is another opening somewhere deeper. The chamber, when it opens, is roughly the size of a small church. Their lights find the evidence of habitation piece by piece, and the effect is cumulative and awful, because each individual thing is explicable and the sum of them is not. Animal hides, many of them, stacked and layered into a kind of nest against the far wall. Stone tools, not Neolithic museum pieces, crude, heavy, functional things, worked recently enough that the flake scars are still sharp. Sharpened wooden stakes leaned against the rock in a bundle. A fire pit, cold at the edges, warm at the centre. Bones, split lengthwise, the marrow taken out of them. And on the wall above the nest, in soot, handprints, human in shape, correct in every proportion, and so large that Pike, who is 6 feet 2, can place his own hand inside one and have room on every side. 6 fingers. Mercer is still describing it into the recorder when the thing comes out of the side passage. Every account of what happened next agrees on the physical description, and the consistency is either evidence that something real was seen, or evidence that a story hardened early and stayed hard. I will give it to you the way it is given. It stands somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall, and it has to stoop under the ceiling, which is the detail that people who have never been in a cave underestimate, because it means the thing lives permanently bent, and it is used to it, and it moves at that height without thinking about it. Its skin is pale under an accumulation of grime and ash so old that it has become a texture rather than a layer. Its hair and beard are dark red, not orange. The deep rust red of dried blood, matted into ropes, hanging past its chest. Its eyes are deep set beneath a heavy brow, and they are, by every account, the worst part. Not because they are inhuman, because they are not. They are recognisably, unbearably human eyes, and they are looking at the men in the room the way a man looks at other men, with intention and calculation, and something that Vale later described, in the only interview he ever gave, as insult. As though they had walked into a house. It has 6 fingers on each hand. It is wearing hides, stitched together with braided sinew, in an arrangement that is unmistakably clothing rather than covering. And in its right hand it is holding a spear, not a stick, a spear, a shaft the thickness of a man's forearm, and mounted on it a worked head of dark stone, napped to an edge, bound on with wet hide that has dried and shrunk to lock it in place. Somebody made that. Somebody sat down and made that on purpose. It does not hesitate. That is the detail that survivors of the story emphasize most, and it is the detail that separates this from every other monster in every other campfire tale. Monsters are supposed to lurk. They are supposed to stalk and circle and be glimpsed and give you a chance to be afraid in an orderly way. This thing sees 7 armed men in its home, and it charges immediately. And the reason it charges immediately is that it has done this before and it knows exactly how it goes. The distance is closed in under 2 seconds. The spear takes the operator nearest the passage through the torso and does not stop there. It carries him backward off his feet and pins him against the cave wall, and the shaft holds, and he stays up there, and there is a period of some seconds in the middle of the worst thing any of them will ever experience in which he is still alive. Then the room comes apart. Everyone fires. In a stone chamber that size, with that many weapons, the noise is not survivable in any normal sense. It becomes a physical pressure. Men lose their hearing permanently in the first 4 seconds. Muzzle flash strobes the walls. Dust and rock fragments come off the ceiling in sheets, and the thing keeps coming. This is the claim that makes people dismiss the story, and I understand why, so let me put it as fairly as I can. The claim is not that bullets bounced off it. Nobody in the story ever says that. The claim is that the rounds went in and did not achieve what rounds are supposed to achieve, which is not actually the same thing. Standard rifle ammunition stops a person primarily through a combination of blood loss and nervous system disruption. It works because of how a human body is proportioned. Now scale that body up by a factor of 2.5. Increase the muscle density. Increase the bone density. Move the vital structures deeper under a thicker wall of tissue. Add whatever blood volume comes with over 1,000 pounds of mass. A wound that would drop a man in 4 seconds might, on something built like that, take a minute. A minute is a very long time in a room that size. Reddick empties 1 magazine into its face and upper chest, changes magazines, and empties another. He's later described as having done this from a distance of about 4 meters, standing, which if it is true tells you something about Reddick. Pike gets a heavier weapon into play. The thing is roaring the entire time, and here again is the detail that will not go away, no matter how many times people try to file this story under bear attack or hallucination or invention. Several of the men insisted separately in different rooms to different interviewers that it was not simply making noise, that there was structure in it, repetition, the same sequences returning. That it was, and this is the word that appears in the story again and again, shouting. It goes down finally in the middle of the chamber, and it takes a number of rounds that nobody in the story is ever willing to state out loud, and when it goes down, it does not go down all at once. It goes to its knees first, then forward onto one hand, then over, and after it stops, its hands keep moving, not twitching, closing, opening and closing slowly for almost a full minute, while 7 men stand in the ringing dark and point their weapons at a thing on the floor of a cave in Afghanistan and try to understand what has happened to their lives. Then it stops, and the only sounds left in that chamber are the sound of a dying man against the far wall, and the sound of dust falling, and the sound of Farid Azami praying very quietly in the entrance passage with his back to all of it. Vale calls it in. He does not know how to call it in. There is no phrasing for this. He gets on the net and reports contact. 1 friendly killed, 1 hostile killed, and requests immediate extraction, and he is trying to figure out how to describe the hostile in a way that will not end his career when the response comes back. The response does not come from his command. It comes from a call sign he has never heard, on a frequency he was not briefed on, and it comes back inside 11 seconds. The voice is calm. It is not asking questions. It does not ask him to repeat, does not ask for clarification, does not ask what he means. It gives him 3 instructions. Do not photograph the body. Do not move the body. Hold position and secure the site. And Vale, standing over 13 feet of dead thing with his ears bleeding, understands something that will not let him sleep properly for the next 20 years. They already knew. Whoever that voice belonged to, they were not surprised. They had a procedure. Somewhere in a building far away there was a page in a binder for exactly this, and somebody had turned to it, and the first line on that page was about photographs. The helicopter arrives in under 40 minutes, which in that terrain, in that year, is not a response time. It is a proximity. It means it was already flying. It is unmarked. No tail number, no unit markings, nothing painted on it at all except a matte finish that eats light. The crew that comes off it wear black uniforms without insignia, without name tapes, without rank. They have their faces covered. They do not identify themselves. They do not speak to the team except to give directions, and they are carrying, folded under one man's arm, a containment sheet, and slung between 2 others, a reinforced cargo net that is very obviously not sized for a human being. They brought the right bag. Nobody had told them the size. The recovery takes 3 hours. Before the body is wrapped, 2 of the black uniformed men take measurements, and they do it with a fluency that suggests practice. They are not exploring. They are filling in fields. The numbers that circulate in this story, and which have never appeared on any document anyone can produce, are these. Height, over 13. Feet. Weight, estimated at more than 1,000 pounds. 6 digits on each hand and each foot, all fully formed, all with nails rather than claws. An additional pair of molars in each side of the lower jaw, in a mouth otherwise arranged exactly like ours. A brow ridge heavy enough to shadow the eyes at any angle of light. Hair, dark red, on the head, the face, the chest, the forearms, the backs of the hands, and nothing on it, anywhere, that was manufactured. No metal, no woven fabric, no thread, no plastic, nothing that came out of any economy. Everything it wore and everything it carried came off an animal or out of the ground within a day's walk of where it was standing. Pike, who is a medic and therefore cannot help himself, gets close enough during the wrapping to put the back of his hand against the thing's shoulder, and he tells Vale afterward that it was warm. Not residually warm, not the warmth a large body holds for a while. Warm, an hour and a half after death, in a cave in the mountains in March. Vale asks one of the black uniformed men directly what it is. The man does not tell him to be quiet. He does not invoke security. He looks at the shape in the sheet and then back at Vale, and he says 3 words that have become the most quoted line in the entire legend, precisely because of how much is packed into how little. He says it is not the first one. While the recovery is underway, the team searches deeper. They find the missing patrol, not the men. There are no complete bodies anywhere in that cave system. What they find are pieces of equipment distributed through the chambers with no pattern to it, the way a dog distributes what it has been given. Fragments of uniform, a boot, body armour with the plate still seated in the carrier, dented inward. Identification tags, 4 of the 6 sets, found in 3 different chambers, and in one small side chamber, on a flat wall, they find the marks, hundreds of them. Vertical rows, cut into the rock with something hard, running from about waist height to well above the reach of any man. Some of them cut so long ago that the edges have rounded and darkened. Some of them cut recently enough to still be pale where the stone was opened. First stands and looks at that wall for a long time, and then he says he does not think it is writing. He says he thinks it is a count. Nobody asks the obvious follow-up question out loud. But every man in that chamber does the arithmetic in his own head, and every one of them arrives at the same answer, which is that if each mark is a person, then this thing and whatever came before it have been taking people out of these mountains for longer than the country in whose army they serve has existed. And then, behind the nest, behind the hides, behind the fire pit, they find the door. It is not a natural feature. It is a rectangular opening in the rock, cut deliberately, with squared corners and a lintel, and it has been sealed with stone, sealed from the outside. The giant had piled rock against it. That is the only reading that the arrangement allows. The larger stones are on the chamber side. The fill is packed inward. The thing that lived in that cave had spent an unknown amount of time and effort keeping that doorway closed. It had built a wall at the front of its home to keep people out, and it had built a wall at the back of its home to keep something in. The black uniformed men order the doorway opened. They do not consult Vale about this. They do not discuss it. 2 of them go to work on the stone with tools they brought with them. Tools which are also, Vale notes, exactly right for the job, and within an hour there is a gap large enough for a man to pass through. Beyond it the cave changes. The passage on the other side is not a cave passage. It is smooth. The walls have been worked, and they have been worked to a finish that no stone tool produces, with tool marks running in parallel courses that Mercer, who grew up around his father's machine shop, stands and stares at for a long time without saying anything. The floor is level. The floor is deliberately level, and the passage descends at a consistent grade into the dark, further than any light they have will reach. One of the black uniformed men puts a hand flat on Vale's chest and tells him that his team is done. They are walked back out through their own footprints and put on the helicopter, and the last thing Vale sees as they lift is 4 men in black going in through the gap in the stone with the lights on their heads, and the ridge falling away, and the whole valley turning red in the late sun exactly the way the name says it does. They are not flown to their base. They are flown to a facility that none of them can afterward place on a map, and they are separated on arrival, and they are kept separated for 11 days. If you want to understand how a story like this gets buried, this is the part to pay attention to, because there is nothing supernatural in it at all. It is just technique, and the technique is very old and very effective, and requires no conspiracy larger than a room. Each man is asked to describe what happened. Then he's asked again, 6 hours later, by a different person. Then he's asked again the next morning, and the questions have shifted very slightly, and now some of them contain small errors. The interviewer refers to the animal. The interviewer asks how large he estimated the bear to be. The interviewer asks whether the low light and the dust and the adrenaline might have affected his perception of scale, and mentions in passing that scale misjudgment in enclosed spaces is extremely well documented, which is true and is the reason it works. By the 5th day, each man has told the story between 15 and 20 times, and he has told it alone, with no one to confirm it, in a room with no windows, to people who are unfailingly kind and who write everything down. By the 8th day, they stop asking. On the 9th day, they are given the narrative. They are told that the reconnaissance patrol was ambushed and killed by insurgents, that the search team entering a cave complex in pursuit encountered a heavily armed hostile, that one American soldier was killed in the engagement, that the hostile combatant was neutralised, that the remains were recovered by an Allied element for identification purposes. Every unusual detail is to be omitted, not denied, omitted. There is a difference, and the men are made to understand it. Nobody asks them to lie. They are simply told which parts of the truth are classified, and reminded with paperwork that disclosure of classified information carries criminal penalties under federal law, and asked to sign. All of them sign. Of course they sign. They are all somewhere in their 20s and 30s. They have careers and pensions and mortgages and families. They have just come out of the worst 48 hours of their lives, and the alternative to signing has been left carefully undescribed. Reddick, according to the story, asks one question during his final interview. He asks whether anyone is going to tell the families of the 6 men what actually happened. He is told that the families will be told that their sons died in combat, which has the advantage of being, in every way that matters to a family, true. Meanwhile, in a laboratory somewhere, the samples are moving. Blood was taken at the site, tissue was taken, and the story of what came back from that analysis is, honestly, the least verifiable part of this entire legend, and also the part that the people who tell it care about most, because it is the part that turns a monster into a category. The preliminary findings, as they are described in the story, include the following. Proteins compatible with human biology. Not similar. Compatible. Growth factor markers at concentrations that do not appear in any healthy adult human being, in patterns that do not match any known growth disorder. Bone density at the far edge of what living tissue can support. Cellular structures showing signs of extreme age in an individual that appeared, by every soft tissue measure, to be in the prime of life, and genetic sequences that mapped cleanly against human reference material across most of their length, and then, in specific regions, did not map against anything. The full report reportedly exists for 72 hours, then it does not exist. The technician who processed the primary sample is transferred to another facility within the month. He is, by all accounts, a quiet man in his 40s who liked his job. Some months later he dies in a single vehicle accident on a road with good visibility and no other traffic, and the report finds no mechanical fault and no substance in his blood. I want to be honest with you about that detail because it is the kind of detail these stories always contain. Single vehicle accidents happen. Tens of thousands of people die in them every year, and almost none of those deaths are anything but exhausting bad luck. The reason it appears in the legend is not that it proves anything. It appears because it is the shape the story needs, and stories, like water, find the shape they need. What happens to the paperwork over the following year is more interesting and considerably harder to explain away. The missing reconnaissance patrol is retroactively attached to a different combat action entirely, one that occurred on a different date in a different district. The soldier killed in the cave is recorded as having died in a separate incident 2 weeks later, in a place he was never in. Flight logs for the extraction are amended, not deleted. Amended, which is worse because it means somebody sat down and did it by hand. Satellite imagery for the valley across a 9-day window is unavailable, and remains unavailable. The unmarked recovery element does not appear in any order of battle for that theatre in that period. As an organisational entity, it never existed, and the coordinates of that cave are quietly folded into a restricted aerial operation zone with no stated reason, and remain inside it for years, in a country where restricted zones were reserved for things like ammunition dumps and airfields, and not for empty mountains. 6 men vanish. 7 go in after them. 6 come back out. And on paper, none of it ever happened at all. Now let the years pass. Let the war grind on and get complicated and stop being on the news every night. Let the men involved come home and get older. and go quiet in the particular way that men who signed things go quiet. This part of the story begins with a package on a porch. The man who receives it is a former army intelligence specialist named Elias Varden. He had spent his career in analysis rather than in the field, which is to say that he spent it reading signals summaries, logistics manifests, transit records, fuel receipts, cargo weights, the unglamorous mass of paper that an army generates simply by existing, and inside which, if you know how to read it, a great deal of the truth is sitting in plain sight because nobody thought to hide the boring parts. That skill is the reason this story does not end in a cave. The package comes from the widow of Corporal Ian Mercer, the communications specialist who had been in that chamber with his recorder running. Mercer had not done well. That is the plain way to say it. He came home and he could not sleep, and then he could not sleep for years, and the insomnia turned into the things insomnia turns into. He drank. He became convinced that his phone was being monitored, and then convinced that his car was, and then convinced of larger and less arguable things. He told his wife repeatedly that the government had lied about what happened in Afghanistan, and she believed him for a while, and then she believed him less, and then she stopped being able to tell which of the things he said were the war and which were the illness. He died at 44, of a heart that had been running at full throttle for 2 decades, and afterward his wife found a box in the garage and she did not know what to do with it, and she sent it to the only name in his address book who had ever taken his calls. Inside it are 5 things: a damaged field recorder, a set of hand-drawn maps, obsessively detailed, showing a valley, a ridge, a cave entrance, and an interior layout of chambers and passages, including one marked simply with the words, "Lower Door." Photocopies of medical notes, including 2 pages of a physical exam describing an old crush injury to Mercer's left shoulder and forearm, with a note that the pattern of the injury was inconsistent with the mechanism the patient described. Photographs of that shoulder, taken years apart, showing a pattern of scarring that Varden looks at for a long time before he understands what he is looking at, which is the shape of a grip. And a list of 11 names, written in Mercer's handwriting, with 3 of them crossed out. Varden's first assessment is compassionate and completely dismissive. He has seen this before. A good soldier comes home broken, and the brokenness organises itself around the worst day of his life, and builds a structure out of it, and the structure gets more elaborate every year, because that is what an unquiet mind does with a fact it cannot digest. He almost puts the box in a closet. Then he charges the recorder. He listens to it twice through at night with headphones in his kitchen. Then he listens to the last 40 seconds 11 more times, and then he does the thing that ends his ordinary life, which is that he opens a laptop and starts looking at cargo manifests. Because here is what Elias Varden knows that almost nobody who tells this story knows. You can classify an event, you can classify a report, a photograph, a body, a location, a program, a name. What you cannot easily do is make a heavy object move from one continent to another without generating a paper trail, because heavy objects require aircraft, and aircraft require fuel, and fuel requires accounting, and accounting is the one religion the United States military actually practices. So he does not look for the giant, he looks for the weight. It takes him 14 months. What he finds is a cargo flight departing an airfield in southern Afghanistan on a date that matches, routing first to a base in Germany and then onward to the continental United States, which is in itself a completely ordinary itinerary. Thousands of flights flew that route. What is not ordinary is the manifest. The cargo is described in a single line, with no item breakdown, no consignee listed in the usual field, and a handling code Varden has seen perhaps 4 times in his career. Biological material, priority black. The declared weight is over 1,000 pounds. The destination is not a mortuary facility. Remains coming out of that theatre went through a specific and well-documented process, at a specific and well-known place, and that process exists precisely so that no American family ever has to wonder where their son is. This did not go there. It went to an installation associated with aerospace medicine and classified biological research, which is a phrase that covers a very large number of legitimate activities and one or two others. And when Varden traces the receiving end, the chain of custody simply stops. There is no intake record. There is no autopsy number. There is no disposition. 1,000 pounds of biological material arrives at a facility in the United States of America and then ceases to be tracked by any system he can reach. What he finds instead, appended to the transfer authority, is a program designator. 2 words and a number, and the number, of course, is spelled out on every version of the document that has ever been shown to anyone. Section 12. Section 12 is where the story stops being about one dead thing in one cave and becomes about a category of problem that somebody in the United States government had already decided needed a filing system. Because you do not create a program for an anomaly, you create a program for a recurrence. Varden works the 11 names on Mercer's list. 9 of them are real people he can locate. Every one of them, without exception, executed a revised non-disclosure agreement within 18 months of the Kandahar recovery, which is unusual in itself because an NDA is not normally something you go back and redo. You redo it when the scope of the secret has changed. 4 of them left military service inside 2 years, several of them at points in their careers where leaving made no financial sense at all. 2 of them have no public record after 2006, not deceased, not retired, simply absent in a country where being absent from every database at once takes effort. And one of them, the last name on the list, and the only one Mercer had underlined, was a linguist. That is the detail that changes the shape of Varden's investigation, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go on. If you recover a large unknown animal, you call a biologist, you call a comparative anatomist, you call a geneticist. There is no reason on earth to call a linguist. You call a linguist when something has said something. Varden begins pulling threads that he expects to go nowhere, and instead finds a small, consistent and quietly obsessive body of analysis inside the defence community that had been circling this problem for decades before anyone walked into that cave. There is a memorandum, described second-hand by 2 separate sources, that compares the Kandahar recovery to a set of historical accounts. It lists them without commentary, the way an analyst lists things when he does not want to be quoted having an opinion. The Nephilim of the Hebrew texts, the sons of the Watchers, described as being on the earth in those days and afterward. The Anakim, the people of unusual stature said to have held the hill country, whose name survives in place names long after they stop appearing as people. The Rephaim, a word so old and so slippery that translators have rendered it as giants, as healers, and as the shades of the dead, sometimes in the same chapter. The giant warrior traditions of Central Asia, which are so widespread across so many unrelated language groups that folklorists treat them as a genuine puzzle rather than a coincidence. And ancient Persian and Greek accounts of tall, pale, red-haired peoples living in the mountain systems east of the empire, which is a description that has been dismissed as fantasy for 2,000 years and which, awkwardly, keeps turning out to describe real populations whose descendants and whose mummified dead have since been found across the same corridor. The memorandum reaches no religious conclusion. It is very careful about that. It uses a term that Varden describes as the coldest phrase he has ever read in a government document, because it takes something that entire faiths are built on and turns it into an item of natural history. Residual hominid population. That is the theory in its bureaucratic form. Not angels, not demons, not aliens. Simply the proposition that a divergent branch of the human family, adapted to extreme size and extreme isolation, survived in the least accessible terrain on the continent, in numbers too small to be noticed and too dangerous to approach, doing what small isolated populations do, which is to become legend to their neighbours, and then become nothing at all. And once Varden is holding that idea, he starts finding its fingerprints everywhere. He tracks excavation reports across Afghanistan, across eastern Turkey, across the Caucasus, across the Levant, going back 150 years. He's looking for one thing only, because one thing is all he can search on. He's looking for skeletons out of range. He finds more than he expects to. Not many, but more than none, and clustered. And in nearly every case the same sequence occurs, and the sequence has a rhythm to it that becomes almost funny after the fourth or fifth time, if you have the kind of humour that survives this sort of work. The find is reported locally with enthusiasm. A regional newspaper or a survey bulletin carries a short item, sometimes with a photograph. A specialist arrives. The remains are reclassified, usually as a burial of ordinary dimensions that was misreported by an inexperienced excavator, which does happen, and which is a completely reasonable explanation for perhaps half of them. The photographs cease to be available, the bones are transferred, and the transfer destination is either a private collection, an institution that has no record of receiving them, or is not recorded at all, and the excavation site is closed, and in a striking number of cases is subsequently built over, flooded by a dam project, or absorbed into a military zone. There is one anatomical detail that recurs in the sealed and second-hand versions of these reports, and does not appear in any of the public versions, and Varden finds it 4 separate times in 4 separate countries, in documents that could not plausibly have been copying each other. 6 fingers, 6 toes. Then there is the hair. Of everything in this story, the red hair is the detail that most people file under embellishment. It sounds invented. It sounds like something added to a story around a fire to make it vivid. The way a storyteller adds a colour because grey is not frightening. Varden thought so too, until he started looking for it on purpose. He finds it in oral histories collected from the mountain villages, in accounts that predate any American presence by generations, describing beings in the high places with hair the colour of rust, who were there before the ancestors came, who were driven up rather than driven out. He finds it in the folklore that clung to the region during the campaigns of Alexander, in stories of a people in the eastern mountains too large and too pale to belong to any of the nations the army had crossed. He finds it in the recollections of Soviet soldiers from the 1980s, who came home from that war with a set of mountain stories that Russian folklorists have collected and largely ignored, and which contain again the same 3 elements: great size, caves, red hair, and he finds it, most unsettlingly, in a gap. There was a British surveyor in the second half of the 19th century, part of the great mapping efforts that were as much about empire as about geography, who kept the meticulous kind of journal those men kept. His journals are archived. They are complete, except that a run of pages is missing from the volume covering a season in the northern passes, and the missing pages are not torn out crudely. They were removed by someone who cared about the binding. What survives is a reference to them in a letter written by a colleague, who mentions, with the polite scepticism of a Victorian gentleman describing a friend's embarrassing episode, that the surveyor had recorded an encounter with a vast red-haired man in the hills, and had been sufficiently affected by it to request reassignment. That letter is the whole of it. One sentence, in a private correspondence, in an archive, about a page that is gone. And Varden sits with that for a while, because it reframes everything. If it is real, the Kandahar encounter was not an event. It was a recurrence, in a place where it had recurred before, and the only genuinely new thing about it was that this time the people who found the body had helicopters. Which brings him to Captain Noah Vale. Vale is not easy to find, because Vale has spent a great deal of energy on not being found. He's living under a different name in a small town, doing work that has nothing to do with anything he was trained for, and when Varden finally sits down across from him, it is in a diner at 11 in the morning with nobody else in the place, which Vale chose. Vale will not talk about the giant. That is the first surprise. Varden has come with the recording, with the manifest, with the photographs of Mercer's shoulder, prepared for an hour of careful persuasion, and Vale waves all of it away like a man refusing a dessert menu. He says the body was never the secret. He says people always fixate on the body, and that the body is the least interesting thing that came out of that mountain, and that if the body had been the whole of it, They would have been debriefed for 2 days and sent back to work with a story about a bear. Then he asks Varden a question. He asks whether he knows what was behind the lower door. Varden says no. And Vale, who has not talked about this to another living person in more than a decade, looks out the window at the parking lot for a long moment and then tells him. After the body was lifted out, a second element went down that smooth descending passage. Not the black uniformed men who had come for the recovery. A different group arriving 2 days later with equipment, with lights, with atmospheric monitoring gear, with people who were very clearly not soldiers. Vale was not sent down with them. He was held on the ridge for 6 days as part of the outer security cordon, which is how he knows what he knows, because in 6 days on a mountainside men talk, and because he watched what came up. The passage runs down for a distance that he heard given more than once, as somewhere over 400 feet of descent. And then it opens into a chamber. The chamber is enormous, natural in origin, worked afterward. The floor is level. The walls have been cut back in places to widen it, and around its perimeter and in rows across its floor there are platforms of stone. There are bodies on the platforms, not corpses, skeletons, ancient, dry, and complete. And they are all enormous. Some of them are larger than the thing that had been killed at the entrance, and the largest of them, according to the number that Vale heard on that ridge, and that he has never been able to unhear, was laid out over a length that would put it well past 16 feet. Several of them wear ornaments, corroded metal mostly at the throat and the wrists, of workmanship that nobody on that mountain could identify. They are arranged. That is the word Vale keeps using. Not dumped, not fallen, not stacked. Arranged with care, each one on its own platform, in an order that implies rank or family or time. It is a tomb. The thing that came out of the side passage and put a spear through an American soldier had not been living in a cave. It had been living at the entrance to a cemetery, and one platform near the centre was empty. At the centre of the chamber between the platforms stood the tablets. There were several of them, upright, of a dark stone that had been brought in from elsewhere, and their faces were carved. The script on them is described, in the version of the story that survives, as resembling early Semitic and Mesopotamian writing systems, without matching any of them. Certain sign shapes are recognisable. The structure is recognisable. But the specialists who eventually looked at photographs of those faces came back with an assessment that made the problem far worse rather than better, which is that the writing appeared to be older than the systems it resembled. Not a variant, not a regional dialect of a known script. An apparent script for the earliest writing systems on Earth, sitting 400 feet under a mountain in Afghanistan, in a room full of oversized dead, is not an archaeological discovery. It is a demolition charge placed under the foundations of the entire accepted timeline of human civilization. A partial translation is attempted. The story preserves only fragments of what came back, and the fragments are, in fairness, exactly the fragments a story like this would preserve, so hold them lightly. There is reference to watchers. There is reference to sons born from unions that the text describes as forbidden, using a construction that the translators rendered as against the boundary. There is reference to a great destruction, in language that reads less like a flood narrative and more like an account of a war. And there is reference to survivors, who are said to have been driven into, or sent into, or placed within the mountains to the east. The verb is apparently ambiguous, and the ambiguity is the entire problem. The report that accompanies those translations makes one recommendation. It recommends that the site and all material recovered from it be classified indefinitely, and it gives as its rationale that the contents of the chamber, if authenticated, would require the revision of accepted human prehistory. Varden asks Vale the question anyone would ask, which is why. Why bury it? Why not the greatest announcement in the history of science? And Vale gives him 3 answers, and none of them are about the truth, and all of them are about consequences. The first is religious. Consider what a verified 13-foot humanoid with 6 fingers, recovered beside a tomb inscribed with references to watchers, and forbidden sons actually does to the world. It does not settle anything. It ignites everything. Every faith with a giant tradition in its scripture, and that is a great many of them, receives what its most literal readers will regard as physical proof, and every secular institution that has spent 2 centuries building the modern account of human origins receives what its critics will regard as proof of a cover-up. And both of those groups will be partly right, which is the worst possible outcome, because partly right is unfalsifiable. And then there is the question of who owns the bones. A tomb of that significance in that region, in that year, would become a possession worth fighting for within a week. Not metaphorically, actually. The second answer is military, and it is uglier, and it is the one that Vale clearly believes. Look again at that list of biological findings, but read it as a requirements document instead of a curiosity. Extreme muscle density, bone that does not fracture under loads that would shatter ours, clotting fast enough to close a penetrating wound in the middle of a fight, tissue that continues functioning after trauma that should end function immediately, night vision in a species that lived in caves for an unmeasurable span of time, cellular age markers suggesting a lifespan considerably longer than ours. Now imagine that list arriving on the desk of a defence research organisation in the winter of 2002, in an institution that had spent the previous 50 years funding studies on fatigue resistance and blood substitutes, and wound closure and dark adaptation. And ask yourself whether the question anyone in that building asks is where did it come from? It is not. The question is, what can we use? The origin of the thing becomes an academic footnote. The genome becomes a parts catalogue. Vale says that is what Section 12 was for, not to study a giant, to harvest one. The third answer is the one that made Varden put down his coffee. Vale points out mildly, as though mentioning a scheduling coincidence, how many long-running operations in that theatre over the following years took place in the immediate vicinity of cave systems, archaeological sites, and mountain districts with old stories attached to them. Not all of them, not most of them, but more of them than the geography of an insurgency would predict. A combat zone is the perfect excavation permit. It closes roads, it empties villages, it removes journalists or embeds them where you can see them. It makes aircraft movement unremarkable, because everything is moving. It makes heavy equipment unremarkable. It makes casualties unremarkable. It makes an entire valley disappear from the world's attention for a decade, and nobody asks why, because there is a war on, and war is its own explanation for everything. Vale is careful about the claim, and I will be careful about it too. He does not say the war was fought for this. That is the version that circulates online, and it is not what he says, and it is not what the story actually supports. He says the war was not started because of them. He says that once they were found, the war made the search possible, and then he pays for his own coffee and leaves, and Varden never sees him again. There is one thing Vale said in the diner that Varden did not understand until much later, and it is the hinge on which the whole story turns from a mystery into something considerably worse. Varden had assumed, as everyone assumes, that the thing in the cave was the last of its kind. That is the comfortable version. A final survivor, ancient and alone, defending the graves of a people already extinct. It is almost a tragedy in that shape. You can feel something for it. Vale told him that the assumption was wrong, and that the evidence had been sitting in the chamber the entire time, and that it was so obvious nobody said it out loud for 2 days. The tomb had been maintained. There was ash in the lower chamber, and the ash was not old. There were animal remains that had been brought down there recently. There were places where the stonework of the platforms had been repaired, and the repairs used material that had been cut and fitted, and some of that fitting was fresh enough that the dust from it was still lying on the floor beneath it. Somebody had been keeping that room. One creature, living alone at the entrance for however many decades, does not maintain a burial chamber 400 feet down. It does not repair stone. It does not carry meat past its own larder to leave in a room full of skeletons. The thing killed by the American patrol was not a beast that had wandered into a ruin. It was staff, and that means there were others, and that they were on the other side, and that the only reason nobody met them that week is that nobody went far enough. Once Varden accepts that, the rest of his research changes character entirely, because he stops looking for a creature and starts looking for a distribution. Satellite analysis of the surrounding mountain systems, which he obtains in pieces from 3 different sources over 4 years, identifies a set of cave formations across an area of several hundred square miles with a specific and shared profile. Entrances concealed under overhangs, invisible from directly overhead. Approaches sealed by rockfalls that, when the imagery is examined closely, sit at angles that gravity does not produce. And in a small number of them, thermal returns, not large, not dramatic. Just a persistent warm signature venting from a mountainside in winter, in a place where there is no settlement, no road, and no reason for heat. That is fire. Somebody down there is burning something every day, and has been for as long as anyone has been looking. Varden finds a designator attached to the survey work, and it is the only piece of this story that has a name a normal person would recognise as a code name. Operation Long Shadow. Its stated purpose, in the fragments he can source, is counter-terrorism site exploitation. Mapping and clearing cave complexes used by insurgents, which was a real and enormous undertaking in that war, and which explains almost everything about it. Almost, because the site selection criteria, when he finally sees a version of them, do not track with insurgent activity. They track with elevation, with geology, with the presence of pre-modern structures, and with something the document calls anomalous local reporting, which is a bloodless way of saying stories. They were not clearing caves where fighters were. They were clearing caves where the villagers said not to go, and then Varden gets the Russian material, and the Russian material is the closest thing this legend has to independent corroboration, which is why the people who tell it always save it for last. The Soviets were in those mountains for 9 years, and they were in them harder and deeper than anyone since, and the archive they generated was enormous and, for a period in the 1990s, extremely leaky. What Varden acquires is fragmentary and second-hand, and arrives through channels he does not describe, but it describes an incident in 1984 in which a Soviet unit operating in a mountain district went off the air. A recovery element reached them and reported, in language notably restrained for a document nobody outside the ministry was ever supposed to read, the following: impressions in the ground of great size, bodies that had been dismembered rather than killed by weapons, with separations at the joints, stone implements recovered at the site described with a note that they were not of local manufacture and were not old, and hair, coarse and red, recovered from equipment and from the clothing of the dead. The region was closed, not patrolled, closed and marked on internal maps with a restriction, and the internal designation attached to that restriction translates, roughly and awkwardly, into English as ancient man threat, not unknown threat, not hostile fauna, ancient man. Somebody in Moscow, 18 years before an American patrol ever set foot in that valley, had already decided what they were dealing with, and had already decided to leave it alone. And when the Soviets withdrew, they did not hand that file to anyone. The United States found it the hard way. The last stretch of Varden's investigation, before he leaves the country and stops being an investigator and becomes a participant, concerns a building. He traces Section 12, through the transfer authority and through the names on Mercer's list, and through 4 years of patient, boring, unglamorous work, to an underground biological facility in the American Southwest. He never gets inside it. He gets something better, which is a former contractor. The man had worked on a mechanical systems upgrade years after the fact, and had never signed anything more serious than a standard site non-disclosure, because he was a subcontractor's subcontractor, and nobody thought to look at him twice. He kept his working drawings, the way tradesmen do, in a plastic tub in a garage. Varden looks at those drawings for a long time. They show a sub-level with a row of chambers. The chambers have ceilings a little over 20 feet high, which is an extraordinary amount of vertical space to excavate, and pressurise and climate control underground, and which nobody does for storage, because storage does not need air handling. The contractor was told they were large animal research suites, which is a real thing that real facilities have. But large animal research suites do not have doors that lock exclusively from the corridor side, with no interior release, which is a configuration that violates every fire code the contractor had ever worked to, and which he raised at the time and was told not to worry about. They do not have walls finished in an impact-rated composite to a height of 18 feet. They do not have drainage sized the way those rooms were sized. And they do not, as the contractor discovered when he traced the feed lines because he was curious, and because tracing lines is what he did for a living, have a cold storage and delivery system rated for several £100 of raw meat per week, per chamber. There were 4 chambers on that drawing. Varden counts them a number of times, and then, near the end of his research, he finds the manifest that ends any possibility of treating this as a story about a single dead animal in a single cave. It is a transport record, years after Kandahar, on the same routing out of the same theatre. The weight is far greater than the first, and the cargo description is not biological material. It reads Specimen B, and after it, in the condition field, a single word: viable. Sit with that for a moment, because the whole legend has been walking toward it from the first sentence. The first one arrived in a bag. The second one arrived alive. The final piece Varden obtains, and the one he was never able to authenticate to his own satisfaction, is an audio file. It is a recording of a containment event at that facility. It runs a little over 4 minutes, and most of it is exactly what you would expect. An alarm tone repeating, an automated voice giving an evacuation instruction, and a sub-level designation. People talking over each other, some of them shouting, the specific flat urgency of people executing a procedure they have rehearsed and never expected to use. Metal being struck repeatedly from the wrong side of something, and underneath all of it, low, close to the limit of what the recording can carry, a voice. Not a roar, not screaming. Speech. It has the cadence of speech. It has pauses in the places speech has pauses. It repeats a phrase 3 times, with the emphasis in a different place each time, which is a thing human beings do when they are trying to make themselves understood by someone who is not listening. The linguist on Mercer's list is the reason this fragment exists in the story at all, because it is his assessment that circulates with it. He states that the phonology does not match any modern language family he can identify. He states that certain consonant clusters and the overall shape of the utterance are consistent with reconstructed features of very early Semitic language, in a way that he describes with an enormous number of qualifications, and then he offers, explicitly as a speculative gloss, and not as a translation, what he believes the repeated phrase means. He renders it as a sentence of 5 words. You opened the house of the dead. Varden goes back. That is the decision that no reasonable account of this story has ever been able to explain, and Varden himself, in the one piece he published, does not really try. He was in his 50s. He had a life. He had spent 6 years building a case out of manifests and drawings and second-hand assessments, and none of it was going to be enough, because paper about a thing is not a thing. He needed to stand in the room. He finds Farid Azami living in a city far from the mountains, working in a shop, with 2 daughters and a wife, and a completely ordinary life that he had built with the specific intention of being ordinary. Farid says no. Then Farid, over the following months, in a series of conversations, says a different kind of no, and then a smaller one, and eventually says that if Varden is going to do this, he will do it badly and get himself killed, and get a village blamed for it, and that this is the only reason he is coming. They travel for 11 days to reach the Red Valley. The valley has not changed. That is the first thing that strikes Varden, who's been looking at photographs of it for 6 years. It is exactly the same red slopes, the same silence, the same absence of animals. The cave entrance under the overhang is gone, not sealed, gone. The entire face has been brought down with explosives, in a way that a demolition specialist would recognise as thorough rather than expedient. Somebody spent real money making that hole in the mountain stop existing. But Farid has the village stories, and the village stories are older than the demolition, and they describe a second way in on the far side of the ridge, used historically by people who wanted to leave offerings without meeting anyone. It takes them most of a day to find it. It is a fissure barely wide enough for a man, angling down into the rock, and they go into it on their stomachs for the first 30 feet, with a rope tied between them, and then it opens, and they are inside, and they are past the demolition, and they are standing in the smooth passage with the tool marks running in parallel courses along the walls. They walk down for a long time. The chamber, when their lights reach it, is empty. The platforms are still there. Rows of them, exactly as Vale described, cut stone, level, arranged with intention. Every one of them is bare. The skeletons are gone. The ornaments are gone. The tablets at the centre of the room are gone, and the only evidence that they were ever there is a set of shallow rectangular sockets cut into the floor where their bases had stood. Around the chamber there is the debris of an industrial operation conducted underground and then abandoned. Spent lighting units, cable runs stapled to the rock and then cut rather than recovered. Empty crates, a pallet of consumables that somebody decided was not worth carrying back up 400 feet. And on the wall at the far end, in spray paint, in letters 2 feet high, somebody has left the only message in this entire story that was written by a person. Sight cleared. Farid does not look at the wall. Farid is looking at the platforms, and after a while he calls Varden over, and he shows him the thing that neither of them wants to have noticed. The platforms are not all the same. Most of them are intact. Whatever was on them was lifted off carefully by people with equipment and time, but at least 9 of them are broken. The stone slabs are cracked and displaced, and in 2 cases shoved entirely off their supports, and the fracture pattern, on all 9, radiates outward. They were not opened. They were opened from the inside. At the rear of the chamber, past the last row, where the light does not reach from the entrance, there is a layer of fine dust across the floor that has settled since the military left. There are footprints in it, many of them, going both ways, laid down at different times, some over the top of others. The dust is deep enough to hold detail, and the detail is unambiguous. Broad flat pad, deep heel, 6 toes. Some of the prints are the size of the ones Reddick knelt beside outside a camp in 2002. Several of them are considerably larger, and every one of them coming and going leads to the same place, which is an opening at the back of the chamber that does not appear on any of Mercer's hand-drawn maps, because Mercer never got this far. It is a tunnel, and it descends. The Americans did not find a tomb. They found a door, and they broke the seal on it, and then they took everything of value out of the room in front of it, and then they blew the entrance shut behind themselves and flew home. They follow it. Of course they follow it. Every listener to this story has known for the last several minutes that they were going to follow it, and Varden knew it in the diner in the American Midwest 4 years earlier, and Farid knew it the day he agreed to come. The tunnel runs down and it runs long. It is not built. It is natural, an old watercourse, widened in places where the passage narrowed, and the widening is done with the same parallel tool marks as the passage above. They lose track of time in it. There is no way not to. Underground, without daylight, with the same 11 feet of illuminated rock moving in front of you hour after hour, time simply stops being a thing you have access to. And then the air changes. It gets warmer, and it moves, and it carries smoke. And sound arrives, from below and ahead, and the sound is the worst and most extraordinary thing in this entire story, because it is not a roar, and it is not silence. It is the sound of a settlement. The tunnel opens onto a ledge, high on the wall of a cavern so large that their lights do not reach the far side of it, and they turn the lights off because there is light down there already. Below them, spread across the cavern floor, there are fires, dozens of them. There are structures, low, heavy, built out of fitted stone, with roofs of hide stretched over frames, laid out in an arrangement with open ground between them. and there are figures moving among them. Varden counts what he can see and stops counting at 50, and understands that he can see perhaps a quarter of the floor. They are enormous, every one of them. They move slowly, that permanent slight stoop that comes from a life under rock. Some of them are working at the fires. Some are carrying loads that no vehicle in the valley above could have managed. 2 of them are sitting together near a wall, and one of them is doing something with its hands that Varden, from that distance, could not identify and could not stop watching, because it was the unmistakable posture of someone making something. Several of them carry stone weapons, and several of them do not. There are rifles down there, scavenged, mismatched, some of them of a pattern that was obsolete before either man was born. They are carried loosely at the balance point in hands too large for them, and one of the figures near the central fire is wearing, draped across its shoulders like a scarf because it could not possibly be worn any other way, a section of American desert pattern uniform. Farid takes hold of Varden's arm and does not let go for a long time, because there is one more thing on that cavern floor near the base of the wall, in an area with a low stone enclosure around it. There are people down there, small figures, human figures, 11 of them that Varden can count, sitting or lying, some of them moving, in an enclosure with a single opening. And along the wall above that enclosure, hanging from pegs driven into the rock, there are objects, arranged the way people arrange the things they have taken. Webbing, helmets, packs, identification tags in strings of a dozen or more. Some of them catch the firelight and shine. There are decades of them. There are nations of them. Varden had come down here believing he was documenting a cover-up about a dead creature in a cave. What he is looking at is not a cover-up. It is a border, and it has been held from both sides for a very long time, and the men who disappeared in that valley were not victims of a monster. They were casualties of a conflict that nobody had told them they were in. Farid is reading the walls. That is what Farid has been doing while Varden stares at the enclosure. There are carvings around the ledge and along the passage they came in through, and Farid, who grew up on the stories and who spent 5 months learning to render impossible things into English for men with rifles, works through them slowly. He says the marks tell a history. He says the giants did not flee into these mountains. He says they were brought here. The chambers, the platforms, the sealed doors, the smooth passages cut with tools nobody can identify. The whole enormous engineered structure of that mountain was not a tomb built by them for their dead. It was containment, built after a war they lost, by someone who won it. And the stone doors were designed to open in one direction, which means the thing that came out of the side passage in 2002, the thing that put a spear through a soldier's chest and took an unspeakable amount of gunfire to bring down, had been standing at that upper entrance not to keep the world out. It had been standing there to keep its own people in. It was not a monster guarding a treasure. It was a warden. And 7 armed men walked up a mountain and shot it, and then opened the door behind it. Varden gets out. Farid does not. That is the flattest sentence in this story, and it is the one that Varden's published account circles for pages without ever landing on cleanly. They were seen. Something came up the wall toward the ledge, faster than either of them believed possible for that size, and they ran, and only one of them was still running by the time the passage narrowed to the point where size stopped being an advantage. Varden came out through the fissure on the far side of the ridge at some point in the following day. He was found by 2 men from a village on the eastern slope, who fed him and did not ask him anything, which tells you something about that village and about how many times it has done that. He carried out fragments of video and audio on 2 memory cards. He never published them. He got as far as a hotel room in a 3rd country, and he had begun the process of getting the material to people who could authenticate it. And then, on the 4th night, the room was entered while he was in it, and the material was taken, along with his notes, his laptop, and the field recorder that had belonged to Ian Mercer. Nothing else was touched. His money was on the desk. It was still there in the morning. 9 days later, the Red Valley was struck from the air. There is no acknowledged operation. There is no press release, no statement, no claimed target, no reported casualties. What there is in the commercial satellite record that Varden spent his last productive year assembling, is a before image and an after image. In the before image there is a mountain. In the after image, the entire northern face of the ridge has come down into the valley floor, and the valley itself has narrowed by several hundred metres, and where the fissure on the far side used to be, there is now 400 feet of rock. The government of the United States has stated, when asked, that it conducted no operations in that area on that date. That statement, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, is entirely true. It is simply not the same thing as saying that no operation occurred. Varden published one article. It ran in a small outlet that specialises in exactly this kind of thing, which was the only place that would take it, which is itself part of how this works. It was read and enjoyed and dismissed, and it entered the great churning ocean of internet folklore, where it has been copied and stripped of its qualifications and re-embellished 1,000 times over, until the version most people encounter today has neon lettering on it, and a thumbnail with a monster in it, and bears about the same relationship to Varden's careful, hedged, obsessive document as a rumour bears to a witness. The critics were right about everything they said. There is no verified military record confirming the giant of Kandahar. No body has ever been produced. No photograph has ever been authenticated. No genetic material exists in any laboratory that anyone can visit. Every name in the account is unverifiable. Every document is described rather than shown. Every witness is anonymous or dead or has never spoken publicly. The entire structure rests on a 4-minute audio file that no longer exists, from a recorder that no longer exists, given to a man by the widow of a man who was, by his own family's account, extremely unwell. That is the honest summary, and Varden included a version of it in his own article, in the second paragraph, which is not what a hoaxer does. The story faded. These stories always fade. There is a shelf life on outrage, and it is shorter than anybody expects. And then, roughly a year after the mountain came down, Elias Varden received an envelope with no return address, containing a single photocopied page. It was a military shipping manifest. The date on it was 3 weeks after the collapse of the ridge in the Red Valley. The origin was a theatre airfield. The destination was a facility in Nevada that does not appear on the public register of anything. And in the cargo description field, in the flat abbreviated language of logistics, where the whole weight of this story finally comes to rest, were 5 words. 4 biological specimens. Live. Here is the thing about the giant of Kandahar that I want to leave you with, now that the story's over and the lights are down and there is nothing left to be afraid of. The legend, as everyone tells it, is a story about the last of something. That is why people love it. A final survivor, 13 feet tall, red-haired, alone in the dark, defending the graves of a vanished race against the modern world, going down under automatic fire in a cave in a war that had nothing to do with it. That is a tragedy. That is almost beautiful. But that is not what the conspiracy actually says. The conspiracy says that the government did not hide the giant of Kandahar because it was afraid the world would learn that giants had once existed. It hid it because the thing killed in that cave was not the last of its kind. It was the first one brought back. The legend says that American soldiers found a giant in the mountains of Afghanistan. According to the conspiracy, what they actually found was a sealed door, and after thousands of years of it holding, they were the ones who opened it. Settle in. Let the lights go low. Let the room around you soften at the edges. Tonight we're going to talk about a signal. Not a loud one. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that hides underneath everything else. Patient and quiet. Riding along beneath the news broadcasts and the advertisements and the political speeches and the sports games. So far down in the noise floor that no one has any reason to look for it. Unless, of course, you happen to be the one person in the building whose entire job is to look at the noise floor. This is the story of Adrian Keller. It is a story about a man who saw something he was not supposed to see for less than a single second on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and then spent the rest of his life trying to decide whether the world would be better or worse for knowing about it. It is a story about broadcasts, and about bunkers, and about lenses ground in a laboratory that officially never existed. It is about a species of question that, once asked, cannot be unasked. And it begins, as these things so often do, with a man alone in a room full of machines that are humming very softly and very steadily and very slightly out of tune. Close your eyes. Let us go to Nevada. Part 1. The Engineer. The relay station sat 40 miles outside Reno on a low rise of scrub and sandstone where the desert began to give up on the idea of being anything else. It was not an impressive building. It was never meant to be. From the highway, if you happened to glance out the window at the right moment, you would see a squat concrete rectangle the colour of dust, a chain-link fence, a gravel lot with room for 4 cars and never more than one in it, and above all of it, the dishes. 6 of them. Angled up and outward, white paint chalking away under 30 years of sun, aimed at satellites that were themselves slowly, patiently falling out of the sky. The building had a name, technically. It appeared on internal documents as Relay Facility 7. Everyone who actually worked there called it the Shed. Adrian Keller had worked at the Shed for 11 years. He was 36 years old. He had a degree in electrical engineering from a state school he was quietly proud of, a small apartment in Sparks with a balcony he never used, and a job title that took 9 words to say and meant in practice, but he kept old equipment alive past the point where anyone else was willing to try. He was good at it. He was better at it than the job required, which is a specific kind of loneliness that people in maintenance work understand and almost no one else does. He could hear a bearing going bad in a motor from across a room. He could look at a spectrum analyzer and tell you, without measuring roughly what the noise floor was doing that night. He had the sort of mind that noticed when something was 1 degree off, and then could not stop noticing it, and then could not sleep until it was fixed. 11 years of night shifts had given him a relationship with silence that most people never develop. Not the absence of sound, the texture of it. He knew what the building sounded like at 11 at night versus 3 in the morning. He knew the specific pitch the ventilation made when the outside temperature dropped below 40 degrees. He knew which of the 6 dishes creaked in a crosswind and which one stayed silent. He knew what normal sounded like, which is why, on the evening of a Tuesday in early October, he knew immediately that something was wrong. He simply did not yet know what. It started as a maintenance ticket. Nothing more. Dish 4 had been drifting, not badly. A fractional error in the tracking servo, the kind of thing that accumulated over months and eventually meant that a satellite pass, which should have been clean and strong, came in ragged at the edges. The fix was tedious and unglamorous. You climbed the service ladder, you opened the housing, you cleaned the encoder wheel, you reseated a connector that had been slowly corroding since before you were hired, and you came back down. Keller did all of it. It took 2 hours. His hands were cold and there was rust under his fingernails, and the wind coming down off the ridge had that thin edge to it that told you the season was turning. Then he went back inside to check his work. The monitoring room was a long narrow space with fluorescent lights that he had disabled years ago, because he preferred to work by the glow of the screens. There were 14 monitors. 12 of them displayed telemetry, signal strength, error rates, temperature readings, 100 green numbers scrolling gently upward and downward like something breathing. And 2 of them displayed video. This is a detail worth pausing on, because it is easy to misunderstand. The video monitors were not there for entertainment. They were there because the relay station carried commercial broadcast traffic, and the simplest way to verify that a channel was passing cleanly was to look at it. If the picture was clean, the channel was clean. If the picture had artifacts, you had a problem. It was crude, and it was decades old, and it was still the fastest diagnostic anyone had ever come up with. So there were two screens, and on those screens, at all hours, the world played itself out to an audience of one very tired engineer. Keller sat down. He pulled his chair up to the desk. He picked up a lukewarm cup of coffee he had abandoned 3 hours earlier and drank it anyway, because he had done that 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. On the left monitor, a national news broadcast was in progress. The anchor was a man Keller had seen perhaps 10,000 times. That is not an exaggeration. 11 years of night shifts, 6 nights a week, a broadcast that ran on a loop through the small hours. This man's face was as familiar to him as the faces of his own family. More familiar, if he was honest, and he was too tired to be anything else. The anchor had a particular way of tilting his head when he transitioned between stories. He had a specific gesture with his left hand, a small flattening motion that he made when he wanted to signal that a subject was serious. He had a tick where he touched the corner of his mouth during commercial breaks, which the audience never saw but Keller had seen constantly, because the raw feed did not cut away. Keller knew this man, not personally, but in the way that you know a landscape you have driven through every day for a decade. The anchor said something about a trade agreement. He tilted his head. He moved to the next story, and then, for less than 1 second, his face changed. Let us be very precise about what happened, because precision is what the entire rest of this story depends on. The face did not distort. It did not pixelate. It did not smear or tear or drop out in the way that a corrupted digital signal drops out. Keller had seen 10,000 hours of corrupted signal. He knew every failure mode that video could exhibit. He could have listed them alphabetically. This was none of them. What happened was that the features underneath the face changed, while the face itself continued doing exactly what it had been doing. The smile stayed. That was the part that he would come back to over and over in the months that followed, in the small hours, lying awake, staring at a ceiling he could not see. The smile stayed exactly where it was. It did not falter, it did not flicker, it held its shape with perfect confidence, but the eyes behind it had gone deep and hollow, sunk back into a skull that had suddenly become visible under skin gone the colour of old paper. And the expression, the actual expression, underneath all the practiced television warmth, was not an expression at all. It was nothing. It was the absence of anything. A face performing the mechanics of a human being without any human being present behind it. The way a mannequin's face is not sad or happy, but simply, terribly, empty. And then it was gone. The anchor was the anchor again, head tilted, hand flattening, moving smoothly into a story about weather in the Midwest. Keller did not move. He sat in a dark room in the glow of 14 monitors, and he did not move for what he later estimated was somewhere between 40 and 60 seconds. Then he did what any competent engineer would do. He assumed the problem was his. Because here is the thing about people who fix machines for a living. They do not, as a rule, believe in the supernatural. They believe in loose connectors. They believe in thermal drift. They believe in the fact that 99% of impossible events are actually possible events that have been misunderstood by a tired person at 2 a.m. So Keller began to troubleshoot. He checked the monitor. He swapped it for the spare. The problem, whatever it had been, did not recur, but he did not expect it to. He checked the cable. He checked the connector. He checked the demodulator, then the amplifier, then the feed horn on the dish he had spent 2 hours servicing, because obviously, this was his own fault. He had disturbed something. He had knocked a connection loose. He had introduced a fault while fixing a different fault, which is the oldest and most humiliating failure in the entire history of maintenance work. He tore the signal chain apart and rebuilt it. It took him until dawn. He found nothing. Every component tested clean. Every connection was solid. Every reading was exactly where it should have been. The signal path from the satellite to the screen was, by every measurement he could take, in better condition than it had been in years, because he had just spent an entire night obsessively cleaning it. He drove home as the sun came up over the Virginia range, the light coming in low and gold and hard, and he told himself that he had been tired, that he had been staring at screens for 11 hours, that the human visual system does strange things at the end of a long night, that he had seen a shadow and a scan line and a trick of exhaustion, and that this was the end of it. He believed himself for 6 days. Part 2. The Pattern. It happened again on the following Monday. Different broadcast, different network. A political speech, carried live. A senator standing at a podium in front of a wall of flags, saying the kinds of things that senators say in front of walls of flags. And for less than a second, the man at the podium was not a man. The same hollowing. The same paper-coloured skin stretched too tight over a bone structure that was almost right and not right at all. The same absence behind the eyes. And again the same smile, holding steady, doing its work, entirely unbothered by the fact that whatever was wearing it had briefly, catastrophically failed to render. This time Keller did not troubleshoot. This time he recorded. It is important to understand the resources that were available to him, because they were not the resources of an ordinary person, and this is the entire reason the story does not simply end here. Adrian Keller was not a man with a phone camera and a conspiracy blog. He was a satellite communications engineer with unsupervised night access to a facility containing several $1 million of signal analysis equipment. He could capture raw feeds at the bit level. He could store them. He could examine any individual frame down to its component data. He could compare the signal as it arrived from the satellite against the signal as it left the building, and against the signal as it appeared on the screen. And he could tell you the difference between those three things down to a precision that most people cannot imagine. He had, in other words, exactly the tools required to determine whether he was losing his mind. So he began to gather data. He started with a simple question. Was the anomaly in the signal, or was it in his head? The answer came back within a week, and it was the first genuinely frightening thing that happened to him, because the answer was neither. The anomaly was in the signal. He could find it. It was there, in the captured data, sitting in the file, reproducible. He could play it back, frame by frame, and watch the anchor's face hollow out and then fill back in. But when he ran the file through analysis, the anomalous frames were not corrupted. There was no error. There was no data loss, no dropped packet, no misplaced bit. The frames in which the anchor's face became something else were, by every technical measure available, exactly as valid as the frames on either side of them. The broadcast was not glitching. The broadcast was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Keller sat with that for a long time. He was by nature a methodical man, and methodical men respond to fear by making lists. So he made a list. He wrote it by hand, on a yellow legal pad, in the monitoring room, at 4 a.m, in handwriting that got steadily worse as the entry got longer. The list had a title. He wrote it at the top and underlined it twice. Observed anomalies. And then he began, night after night, to fill it in. Over the following 7 weeks, Adrian Keller documented 143 separate incidents. He found them in national news broadcasts. He found them in local news broadcasts. He found them in advertisements, particularly advertisements for banks and pharmaceutical companies and insurance providers, which he noted and did not yet know what to do with. He found them in political speeches at every level, from a presidential address down to a city council meeting in a town of 11,000 people that had no business being carried on the relay at all. He found them in live sporting events. That one disturbed him more than he could easily explain. There was something about watching a man in a suit on the sideline of a football game, a man whose only job was to look concerned and shout at people, hollow out into that same paper-skinned emptiness for 4 frames and then come back. That made Keller put down his coffee and press the heels of his hands into his eyes until he saw colours. He found them in social media streams. He found them in streaming platforms. He found them in corporate earnings calls that were broadcast for reasons of regulatory compliance to an audience of approximately nobody. He found them everywhere. And here is what he found underneath all of it. When he stopped looking at the pictures and started looking at the data, every single anomaly appeared on the same narrow frequency band. Not the same channel, not the same network, not the same satellite, the same band. A slim, unremarkable slice of the electromagnetic spectrum, so narrow that it barely registered as anything at all, riding along underneath the actual broadcast content like a passenger nobody had bought a ticket for. Keller mapped it. He plotted it. He built, over the course of 3 sleepless weeks, a spectral analysis so detailed that a colleague who saw it on his screen assumed he was doing contract work for someone and asked, jokingly, whether he was getting paid extra. He was not getting paid extra. He was, at that point, no longer entirely sure what he was doing. The band was there in every anomaly. It was there in every broadcast he checked, whether an anomaly appeared or not. It was always on. It was always transmitting. And it carried no content that any of his equipment could identify. Not audio, not video, not data in any encoding scheme he could recognise, and he could recognise a great many. It was, as far as his instruments were concerned, a signal that carried nothing. Which is, of course, impossible. Signals cost money. Bandwidth is expensive. Nobody, anywhere, at any point in the history of broadcasting, has ever spent money to transmit nothing. Somebody was paying for that band. Somebody had been paying for it for a very long time, on every satellite, on every network, in every country, whose feeds passed through the shed. And whatever was riding on it, whatever it actually was, it was not nothing. It was hiding. Keller wrote that word on his legal pad, at the bottom of a page, at some point in the small hours of a Thursday morning in the last week of November. Hiding. Then he underlined it, the way he had underlined the title of the list twice, and he sat back in his chair, and he looked at the 14 monitors, and the 14 monitors looked back at him. He did not go home that morning. He sat in the parking lot until the sun came up, and then he sat in it a while longer, and then he drove to a diner on the edge of town and ordered eggs and did not eat them. He had spent 11 years making sure that signals arrived cleanly. It had genuinely never occurred to him to ask what the signals were for. Part 3. The Reporter. There comes a moment in every story like this one when the protagonist must decide whether to tell someone. It is a harder decision than it sounds. Consider Keller's position. He was a maintenance engineer at an aging relay facility. He had no institutional standing. He had no academic credentials beyond a bachelor's degree. He had, on his side, an enormous quantity of extremely technical data that supported a claim so ludicrous that stating it out loud would end his career in the time it took to finish the sentence. He tried, once, obliquely, with a colleague, a man named Ruiz who worked the swing shift and who Keller had eaten lunch with perhaps 400 times over the years. Keller did not say anything about faces. He was not a fool. He asked instead a purely technical question. He asked whether Ruiz had ever noticed a persistent carrier riding in a particular band present across all feeds, carrying no identifiable payload. Ruiz said no. Then Ruiz said, and this is the part, that mattered, that Keller should be careful about spending too much time looking at things that were not on the ticket list, because the contract was up for renewal in 18 months, and the last thing anybody needed was an engineer with an interesting theory. Keller said that was fair. He said he had probably just miscalibrated something. He never mentioned it to anyone at the shed again. Which is how, in the second week of December, he came to be sitting in his apartment in Sparks at 11 at night, composing an email to a woman he had never met. Hannah Voss was 39 years old, and she was, by a considerable margin, the most dangerous journalist working the defence beat in the United States. She had not started there. She had started, as most of them do, covering city government, and she had discovered early that she possessed a particular and slightly frightening gift, which was the ability to read a budget document the way other people read a novel. She could look at a spreadsheet and see a story in it. She could look at a line item and know, with a certainty she could rarely explain and was almost never wrong about, that the number was lying. Over 15 years, that gift had made her enemies in 3 separate industries. She had broken the story on a defence contractor that had been billing the government for work performed by employees who had died. She had broken the story on a media conglomerate that had quietly acquired a majority stake in the polling firm, whose results it reported on as news. She had broken a story about a satellite communications company, and this is the detail that Keller found and could not stop looking at, that had been awarded a maintenance contract for a set of relay facilities under a bidding process that the Inspector General later described, in writing, as fictional. He read that piece 4 times. He read it in the monitoring room, on his phone, with the 14 screens glowing around him. The relay facilities were not named, but the contract number was listed in a footnote, and Keller had seen that contract number on every purchase order that crossed his desk for 11 years. Voss had written about his building. She had written about the shed, 2 years before he ever noticed anything strange happening on his screens, and she had not known what she was looking at, and neither had he. He wrote to her that night. The email was 400 words long, and he rewrote it 11 times. He said nothing about faces. He said nothing that could make him sound like the kind of person who sends emails to journalists at 11 at night. He said only that he was an engineer with access to broadcast infrastructure, that he had identified a persistent, unexplained carrier signal present across every feed he had access to, that the signal did not appear in any documentation he could find, and that he believed someone was paying a considerable amount of money to transmit it, and had gone to some trouble to ensure that nobody asked why. He said he had data. He said he could not send it electronically. He said he would like to meet. He read it one more time. He deleted the last line because it sounded desperate. Then he put it back, because it was true. He sent it at 11:41 at night. She replied in 19 minutes. They exchanged 11 messages over the following 4 days. Her questions were sharp and specific and largely technical, and Keller found himself unexpectedly, almost embarrassingly relieved to be talking to someone who did not immediately try to make him feel insane. She asked what equipment he had used. He told her. She asked whether the signal was present on feeds that originated outside the country. He checked. It was. She asked whether he had told anyone else. He said no. She said, and he could hear something change in the tone of the message. Keep it that way. They arranged to meet on a Saturday in a coffee shop in Reno at 10 in the morning, because she said she was flying in for something else anyway, which Keller believed at the time and did not believe later. She did not come. He waited 2 hours. He drank 3 cups of coffee he did not want. He checked his phone 11 times and then 20, and then he stopped counting. He called her. It rang and went to a voicemail message recorded in a voice that sounded busy and slightly amused. A woman with somewhere to be. He went home. He told himself she'd been delayed. He told himself she was a working journalist with a chaotic schedule, and he was a maintenance engineer with a theory, and that he had probably overestimated how important he was. He was still telling himself that on Monday, when the story appeared. It was not a large story. It was 4 paragraphs on a regional news site filed under local. It said that Hannah Voss, 39, an investigative journalist, had been reported missing by her editor after failing to file an expected piece and failing to respond to contact attempts over a period of 6 days. It said that police had entered her apartment. It said, and Keller read this sentence perhaps 50 times over the following weeks, that there were no signs of struggle. Here is what was in the apartment. Everything. Her coat was on the hook. Her keys were in the bowl by the door. Her shoes were lined up against the wall in the specific way that people who live alone line their shoes up, which is to say without any thought at all. There was a mug in the sink with tea still in it. gone cold and gone dark, sitting in a ring of its own residue. Her laptop was on the kitchen table, open, plugged in, screen dark. When investigators powered it on, they found a machine that had been remotely and completely wiped. Not deleted, wiped. Every sector overwritten. A drive that had been returned, with considerable technical effort and considerable expense, to the exact condition it had been in on the day it left the factory. There were no files, there were no fragments, there was no recovery. And on the table beside the laptop, weighted down under the corner of the machine so that it would not blow away if a window had been open, which no window was, there was a single sheet of paper. It was handwritten. The handwriting was hers. The police confirmed that later, comparing it against a decade of notebooks that were stacked, undisturbed, on a shelf in the next room. It said one thing. The broadcasts aren't controlling us. They're disguising them. That was all. No signature, no date, no explanation. 9 words and a period, written in blue ink, by a woman who had spent 15 years learning how to say exactly what she meant in as few words as possible. Keller read those 9 words on a Monday afternoon in his apartment in Sparks, standing up, still in his coat, having not sat down since he came through the door, and he understood all at once, and with a completeness that made him have to put a hand on the back of a chair, that he had been asking the wrong question for 2 months. He had been asking what the signal was doing to people. The correct question. The question Voss had gotten to in 4 days, working from nothing but his description, and her own catastrophic gift for knowing when a number was lying. The question that had gotten her a wiped laptop and an empty apartment, and a mug of cold tea in the sink. The correct question was what the signal was doing for someone. The broadcasts were not a weapon pointed at humanity. They were a curtain, and there was something standing behind it. Part 4. Operation Beacon. Adrian Keller did not go to the police. This is the decision that people argue about when they argue about this story, and the arguments are usually made by people who have never had to make it. So let us be fair to him. He had no evidence that a crime had occurred. He had never met Hannah Voss. He had exchanged 11 emails with her, on an account he was fairly sure was compromised, in which he had described unauthorized analysis of proprietary signal traffic carried by a facility he did not own, using equipment he was not authorized to use for that purpose, in violation of approximately 9 separate clauses of his employment contract. If he walked into a police station and told them what he knew, the most likely outcome was not an investigation. The most likely outcome was that he lost his access. And his access was the only thing he had. So instead, Adrian Keller became a historian. It is a strange thing to watch an engineer turn into a researcher. Engineers are trained to work forward, from cause to effect, from input to output. Historians work backward. They begin with the wreckage and reason their way toward the collision. Keller was not good at it at first. He wasted weeks. He chased documents that did not exist and filed requests that came back redacted into meaninglessness, and read forum posts written by people who were, he came to understand with great sadness, simply unwell. But he had 2 advantages that most people do not. The first was that he knew exactly what he was looking for. He was not looking for aliens. He was not looking for a conspiracy. He was looking for a specific slice of the electromagnetic spectrum, and he was looking for anyone, at any point in the last 100 years, who had been interested in it. The second was that he had 11 years of night shifts, and he had absolutely nothing else to do. He found it in March. The document was not classified. That is the detail that would keep him awake later. It had never been classified, or if it had been, that classification had lapsed decades ago, and nobody had ever bothered to think about it again. It was sitting in a digitized collection of budget appropriations, held by a university library, available to anyone with an internet connection, and a very high tolerance for boredom. It was a line item. The line item read, in full, Beacon, Electromagnetic Perception Studies, continued funding. That was it. A name, a description, and a number that Keller converted into modern dollars and then converted again, because he assumed he had made an error, and then sat back in his chair when he discovered he had not. The number was enormous. Operation Beacon, whatever it was, had been receiving funding at a level comparable to major weapons programs. Not for a year, for decades. From the middle of the 1940s through to the early 1970s, in an unbroken line growing steadily, buried in appropriations documents under a heading so tedious that no auditor in the history of the Republic had ever read past the first 4 words, Keller began to pull the thread. The official history, when he finally assembled it, was almost aggressively boring, and he came to believe that this was on purpose. Officially, Operation Beacon was a Cold War program dedicated to the study of Soviet communications technology. Officially, it existed to understand how the other side transmitted information, to identify vulnerabilities, and to develop countermeasures. Officially, it produced a series of technical reports on radio propagation and signal intelligence, most of which were published, all of which were dull, and none of which would make any human being on Earth read a second page. Keller read every one of them, and in the 4th report, in an appendix, in a footnote to a table concerning the effects of prolonged exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies on laboratory personnel, he found a sentence that had been sitting in a published document in a public library for 51 years. The sentence said that certain frequencies, when applied within specific parameters, produced measurable and reproducible alterations in subject perception, and that this effect appeared to be strongest in the visual cortex, and that further study was recommended. Keller read it. Then he read it again. Then he stood up and walked around his living room twice and sat back down and read it a 3rd time. Alterations in subject perception. Not hallucination, not sedation. Not any of the words that a program studying mind control would use, because Operation Beacon was not studying mind control. That was the thing. That was the thing Keller understood in his apartment at 1 in the morning in the middle of March, with a 51-year-old technical report open on his laptop. Beacon was not studying how to put things into people's minds. Beacon was studying how to take things out. Specifically, and this was stated with the flat, uninterested clarity of a scientist reporting an inconvenient result, Beacon had discovered that within a narrow band at low power, applied continuously, human beings could be made to fail to see things that were in front of them. Not blindness, nothing so crude. The subjects were not blind. Their eyes worked perfectly. The signal did not touch the eyes at all. It touched the part of the brain that decided what the eyes had seen, and it worked on everyone. The program was officially terminated in 1972. The final report is available. It runs to 60 pages. It concludes that the phenomenon, while scientifically interesting, has no viable military application, and recommends that the research be discontinued and the facilities repurposed. It is signed by a program director whose name appears nowhere else in any document Keller could find before or after, and the funding, according to the appropriations record, stopped in 1972, exactly as the report says it did. Keller believed that for about 6 hours. Then he went back to the appropriations records and did what an engineer does, which is to stop reading what the document says and start measuring what it does. He did not look at the line items, he looked at the totals, and he began, with enormous patience, over a period of 5 nights, to check whether the sum of the parts equaled the whole. It did not. Beginning in the fiscal year 1973 and continuing forward from there, the appropriations for a particular agency contained a discrepancy. It was small as a percentage. It was not small in absolute terms, and it was, when Keller adjusted for inflation and plotted it, almost exactly equal to the Beacon funding line, continuing on its previous growth curve as if nothing had happened at all. The money did not stop in 1972. The money stopped having a name. Part 5. The Arctic Signal. If you want to understand a program, you do not start in the middle of it. You start before it existed, and you ask what made it necessary. Keller went looking for the reason. He found it eventually in 1938. The event is documented, in the way that things were documented in 1938, which is to say inconsistently in 3 separate languages by people who had no idea what they were writing about and no reason to believe it mattered. In the late autumn of that year, a signal was intercepted. It came from the Arctic Circle. That is as precise as the records get, and Keller came to believe that this imprecision was not a coincidence, because the 3 separate listening stations that recorded it were separated by more than 1,000 miles, and when he plotted their bearings, the lines did not converge on a point. They converged on a region, a wide one, which is what happens when a signal is not coming from a single transmitter. It is what happens when a signal is coming from everywhere at once. The transmission lasted, according to the most reliable of the 3 accounts, somewhere between 9 and 14 hours. It repeated. It did not vary, and it contained 3 things. Mathematical sequences, not code, not encryption. Mathematics, in a form so fundamental that the operators who recorded it recognized what they were looking at immediately, because prime numbers are prime numbers in every language that has ever existed or will exist. Geometric patterns, rendered as data, reconstructed later, on paper, by hand, by men who did not know what they were drawing until the drawing was finished, and repeating frequencies, a set of them, specific, narrow, and precisely defined. Keller looked at that list for a long time. Then he went and found the frequencies. They are in the record. They were published in 1939 in a technical bulletin as a curiosity, alongside a note speculating that the transmission was likely an artifact of unusual atmospheric conditions. The bulletin has been digitized. Anyone can read it. Almost nobody has. The frequencies in the 1938 Arctic signal are the same frequencies that Operation Beacon spent 30 years studying. They are the same frequencies that Adrian Keller found hiding underneath every broadcast that passed through Relay Facility 7. They are the same band. He sat with that for 3 days. He did not go to work. He called in sick, which he had done perhaps 4 times in 11 years, and he sat in his apartment with the blinds drawn, and he tried to construct any explanation that did not require the world to be different than he had understood it to be. He could not. Here is what the record shows, and the record is not in dispute. And this is the part that Keller found the hardest to bear, because it is not hidden. It has never been hidden. It is simply boring, and being boring has protected it more effectively than any classification ever could. A signal was received in 1938. Within 18 months, 6 of the researchers who had worked on it disappeared from the public record. Not died, disappeared. Their publications stop. Their university affiliations end. Their names appear on no further papers, no obituaries, no census records that Keller could locate. They simply cease. Within 4 years, a program was created to study the frequencies contained in that signal. That program ran for 30 years, consumed an amount of money that Keller could not stop thinking about, and concluded, officially, that the frequencies had no useful application. And then it kept running for another 50 years without name. And at the end of all of that, in an equipment shed 40 miles outside of Reno, an engineer found those same frequencies riding underneath every broadcast in the world, continuously, at low power, applied to everyone, forever. Beacon did not build the frequency. Beacon found it. And then Beacon spent 30 years learning what it did. And then somebody, at some point, in some room that has never been described in any document that Keller could find, decided that the correct thing to do with a signal that prevents human beings from seeing what is in front of them was not to turn it off. It was to make sure it never stopped. Part 6. The Visitors. The scientists of Operation Beacon reached their conclusion in the summer of 1961. We know this because of a single document, a memo, which Keller found not in an archive but in an estate sale listing, photographed badly, sold as part of a lot of miscellaneous papers belonging to a physicist who had died in 1994 and whose family did not know what they had. The memo is 1 page. It is unsigned. It is addressed to a program director by initials only, and it consists, in its entirety, of a summary of a finding and a recommendation. The finding is this: the signal, the memo says, is not a message. The scientist had spent 23 years operating under an assumption so natural that nobody had ever thought to examine it. A transmission was received. Transmissions carry information. Therefore, the transmission was trying to tell us something, and the task was to work out what. They had spent 23 years trying to read it, and in 1961, one of them, and we do not know which one, asked a different question. What if it is not addressed to us at all? What if it is not communication? What if it is infrastructure? You do not have to understand a great deal of physics to understand the rest, and Keller, who understood a great deal of physics, understood it immediately. The signal did not carry a message because it was not for sending messages. It was doing a job. It was performing a function, continuously, on everything within range of it, and the function had nothing to do with information. The function was concealment. The memo does not use the word aliens. It never once uses that word, and Keller found this significant because the men who wrote it were serious people who had spent their careers being careful. They use a different phrase, and the phrase appears exactly twice, and Keller could not read it without a physical sensation in his chest. They call it an intelligence of non-human origin, present within the human population, and morphologically adapted for concealment. That is the sentence. Read it again slowly. Present within the human population, not arriving, not coming, not observing from orbit or hiding in the deep ocean or waiting on the dark side of the moon. Present. Already here. Already among us. Already. And this is the part that took Keller's breath away in a state of adaptation, which is a word that implies a very great deal of time. The scientists of Operation Beacon had not discovered a signal. They had discovered a curtain, and they had spent 23 years measuring the fabric of it before it occurred to any of them to wonder what it was hanging in front of. Humanity had not been infiltrated recently. Humanity had been infiltrated so long ago that the infiltration had had time to become the normal condition of the world, and the signal was not there to hurt us. The signal was there so that we would not notice. Part 7. How they survived. Let us slow down here, because this is the part of the story that most people get wrong. When you hear a story like this one, your mind reaches for a particular image. It reaches for something monstrous, something with too many limbs, something that would be obviously wrong the moment you saw it, something that could only exist behind a curtain because no curtain could possibly be thick enough to hide it in daylight. That is not what this is. The entire, terrible, elegant premise of the thing Keller found is that the curtain is thin. It has to be. A thick curtain would be obvious. A signal capable of hiding something genuinely radically alien would have to do so much work to your perception that you would notice the work being done. You would feel it. You would walk down the street and you would know that something was wrong with your eyes. But the beings, according to every document Keller assembled over the following year, are not radically alien. They are almost human. Almost. The differences are small. They are so small that in isolation each one is nothing. It is only when you place them next to each other, in a list, on a legal pad, at 4 a.m, that they begin to form a shape. They age more slowly, not dramatically, not visibly, but over decades, in a way that is invisible year to year and undeniable across a lifetime. They are the people who look, at 70, the way you expected them to look at 55, and everyone remarks on it kindly, and nobody thinks about it for more than a moment, because there is always someone who ages well. They rarely form deep emotional attachments. They marry sometimes. They have families sometimes. But the attachment is not there. And if you have ever known such a person, you know exactly what is meant, and you know that we have 100 kind words for it. Reserved, private, focused, difficult to read, a hard person to know, and they gravitate consistently, reliably across every generation toward positions of influence. Not power exactly, not the crown, not the visible seat. Influence, the position beside the seat, the chief of staff, the general counsel, the managing director, the person on the board whose name nobody outside the building knows, who's been there for 30 years, who has seen 4 chief executives come and go, and who is the reason that certain decisions get made and certain other decisions never come to a vote. Keller mapped it, over the course of that year, the way he had mapped the frequency band. He found them, or believed he found them, in finance, in the intelligence services, in media conglomerates, in multinational corporations, in the permanent civil service, in the parts of government that do not change when the government changes. He found them, in other words, exactly where you would put yourself if you were a small population living inside a very large one, and your survival depended on never, under any circumstances, being noticed. You would not seek the throne. Thrones are photographed. You would seek the room next to the throne, and then you would stay in it for 400 years. Part 8. The network. There remained a technical problem, and it was Keller's kind of problem, and it is the reason he was able to get as far as he did. The problem is this: a signal has range. Operation Beacon's research, at least the portion of it Keller could reconstruct, described an effect that required continuous exposure at close range. A laboratory, a room, a subject seated at a specified distance from an emitter. That is not a curtain, that is a very small tent. To hide something from the entire human population, permanently, you would need to bathe every person on Earth in that frequency, at all times, everywhere. In their homes, in their cars, on mountainsides, in cities and villages and boats in the middle of the ocean. You would need to reach every human eye, continuously, forever, with no gaps. That would require an infrastructure of almost unimaginable scale. It would require transmitters distributed across the entire surface of the planet, at every scale, in overlapping coverage, redundant, self-healing, constantly maintained, constantly upgraded and funded at a level that no government could hide. You would need, in fact, exactly the infrastructure that we spent the last 100 years building for ourselves. The satellites, the cell towers, the fibre optic backbone, the broadcast antennas, the relay stations, the undersea cables, the router in your living room, the device in your pocket that you have never once, in your entire life, been more than a few feet away from. Keller sat in the shed with a map of global communications infrastructure on one screen and a spectral analysis on the other, and he understood something that made him laugh out loud, once, and then not again for a long time. They did not have to build it. They only had to encourage it. Every single dollar of the trillions poured into global connectivity over the last century, every act of engineering genius, every entrepreneur who ever stood on a stage and talked about bringing the world closer together, every single one of them was doing exactly what a species living in hiding would most desperately want done. We built the curtain ourselves. We were proud of it. We are still proud of it. We compete to build it faster, and nobody had to be corrupted. Nobody had to be bribed. That is the part that Keller found most difficult, sitting in the dark, watching the green numbers scroll. The conspiracy did not require conspirators. It required only that a handful of people, in a handful of rooms, in every generation, quietly ensure that a certain narrow band be reserved and never audited and always carried, and the rest of us did the work, enthusiastically, for free. Part 9. The lenses. The bunker was in Arizona. Keller found it the way he found everything, which is to say by cross-referencing property records against decommissioning schedules against a 50-year-old maintenance contract for a facility that was described, in the only document that mentioned it, as an optical fabrication annex. Optical fabrication. He drove down in April. It took him 9 hours. He did not tell anyone he was going because there was no longer anyone to tell. The facility was not guarded. That surprised him at the time and stopped surprising him later, when he understood how the whole thing worked. It was a concrete structure set into a hillside, its entrance half buried in 50 years of dirt and creosote, its door secured with a padlock that had rusted into a single solid mass, and that he removed with a pry bar in under 2 minutes. Inside it was dry, and it was cold, and it was almost entirely empty. Almost. There had been machines here once. He could see where they had stood, the pale rectangles on the floor where equipment had sat for decades and been removed. There were empty racks. There were cabinets with their doors hanging open. There were, on a bench in the back room, 4 coffee mugs, arranged in a row, dusty, ordinary, and Keller stood and looked at those mugs for a long time and did not touch them. And in a locked drawer, in a metal desk, under a stack of blank requisition forms, there was a case. It was the size of a hardcover book. It was made of steel and it was heavier than it should have been. It had a label on the top printed on a machine that no longer exists, and the label said only Beacon, Perceptual Correction Assembly, Unit 6. Inside the case was a pair of glasses. They were not beautiful. Keller had, in some part of his mind he was ashamed of, expected them to be beautiful. They were ugly and industrial, and they weighed close to a pound. The frames were heavy machined metal with a serial number stamped into the temple. The lenses were thick, greenish and layered, and when he held them up to the light he could see that they were not one lens but many, stacked, with hair-thin gaps between them, and something in those gaps that caught the light and moved. There was no user manual. There was no explanation. There was, folded once and tucked into the lid of the case, a single index card on which someone had written 6 words in pencil. Do not wear these in public. Keller sat down on the floor of an abandoned bunker in Arizona, with a pair of glasses in his hands, and he understood that he had reached the end of the part of this story where he could still turn around. He could put the case back in the drawer. He could drive 9 hours north. He could go back to the shed and fix the servo on Dish 4, which had begun to drift again, and he could work another 11 years and retire and be, in every way that anyone would ever be able to measure, a completely ordinary man who had lived a completely ordinary life. The signal would keep running whether he looked or not. He thought about Hannah Voss. He thought about a mug of cold tea sitting in a sink in an apartment where nothing had been disturbed. He thought about 9 words in blue ink. He drove back to Reno with the case on the passenger seat. He waited 3 days, and then, on a Thursday at 11 in the morning, standing at the window of his apartment in Sparks, looking out at a parking lot and a strip mall and a stretch of highway, and the mountains beyond, in ordinary daylight, in an ordinary week, Adrian Keller put on the glasses. Part 10. What he saw. The first thing that happened was nothing. That is worth saying, because it is the detail that would convince him later more than anything else. There was no shimmer. There was no ripple. The world did not tear open and reveal itself. The parking lot was still a parking lot. The cars were still cars. The asphalt was still cracked in the places it had always been cracked. The sky was the same sky. The mountains were the same mountains. And the light through his window fell across the floor at exactly the angle it always fell. For perhaps 4 seconds, Adrian Keller thought, with a relief so enormous that it made him light-headed, that he had been wrong about everything. Then he looked at the billboard. There was a billboard across the highway. It had been there for as long as he had lived in that apartment. It advertised a bank. It showed a family standing on a porch, and it had 4 words on it in blue letters, and Keller had looked at that billboard perhaps 10,000 times, and had never once read it, because nobody reads billboards. That is not how billboards work. Billboards are not read. They are absorbed. Through the lenses, the billboard did not advertise a bank. There was no family. There was no porch. There were no blue letters spelling out the name of a financial institution. There was a single word in black filling the entire surface. Obey. Keller made a sound. He would not be able to describe it afterward. He turned his head. The bus shelter on the corner. The one with the poster for a pharmaceutical product. The one with the woman laughing in a field. Consume. The digital sign above the gas station. The one that cycled between the price of fuel and an advertisement for a soft drink. Compete. The screen in the window of the electronics store across the parking lot, playing a loop of a film he had never seen and had somehow watched 100 times. Remain distracted. And on the side of a bus moving slowly down the highway in the late morning traffic, carrying perhaps 20 people who are reading their phones and thinking about lunch, do not question. Keller stood at his window with his hands braced on the sill, and he did not take the glasses off, though every part of him was screaming at him to do it, because he understood with total clarity that he would only be able to do this once, that once he took them off he would begin immediately to construct explanations. He would begin to talk himself out of it. He was an engineer, and engineers are professional talkers out of things, and he knew himself well enough to know that he had perhaps 5 minutes before his own mind began the work of protecting him. So he made himself look. He looked at the street, and in the street, among the ordinary people, going about their ordinary Thursday, walking to their cars and carrying their coffee and talking on their phones, there were faces that were not human. Not many. That was the thing. Not a crowd of them. Not a horde. He counted 3 in the space of 11 minutes. Out of perhaps 200 people, they were doing nothing remarkable. One was loading groceries into the trunk of a sedan. One was standing outside the coffee shop, waiting, checking a watch. One was walking, unhurried, with a bag over one shoulder, in the direction of the office park. They were not watching him. They were not watching anything. They were simply going about the business of a Thursday morning in a small city in Nevada, the way you or I would, the way anyone would. And their faces were the face he had seen on the news anchor, 6 months earlier, for less than 1 second, on a screen in the dark, hollow-eyed, paper-skinned, the bone structure not quite right, not quite wrong, the specific and unbearable almost of a thing that has spent a very long time learning to pass and has very nearly succeeded, and on every one of them, worn like a coat, comfortable, unremarkable, entirely convincing to anyone who happened to glance over, the smile. Keller took the glasses off. The billboard advertised a bank. The woman on the bus shelter laughed in her field, and down on the street, among the ordinary people going about their ordinary Thursday, a man loaded groceries into the trunk of a sedan and closed it and got into his car and drove away. Part 11. The Economy. Keller did not leave his apartment for 9 days. He would tell people later that he was afraid, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth, and he knew it. The whole truth was that he was thinking, and he was thinking in the specific, obsessive, all-consuming way that engineers think when they have been handed a system and cannot rest until they understand what it is optimized for. Because that was the question now. Not who, not how, why. Consider the 5 commands. Sit with them the way Keller sat with them, on a legal pad, in an apartment with the blinds drawn for 9 days. Obey. Consume. Compete. Remain distracted. Do not question. They are not, if you look at them properly, the commands of a conqueror. A conqueror does not need to say obey. A conqueror says kneel, and if you do not kneel, the conqueror kills you, and the matter is settled. Conquest is loud and expensive, and it ends. These are not the commands of someone who wants to rule you. These are the commands of someone who wants you to keep doing something. Keller wrote that on his pad. Then he sat back and looked at it, and felt the floor of his understanding drop out from under him for the 2nd time in a year. What are we producing? Not goods. Goods are incidental. You do not need a global perceptual concealment infrastructure to acquire goods. If you are an ancient species embedded in the highest levels of finance and industry across every continent on Earth, you could simply own things, and by every indication they did. They were not doing this for money. So look again at the commands. Look at what they actually produce in the aggregate across 8 billion people, continuously, for centuries. Obey produces submission, and the low-grade resentment that comes with it. Consume produces appetite that is never satisfied, which is to say permanent structural dissatisfaction. Compete produces division. It produces the conversion of every neighbour into a rival. It produces a species that has spent its entire history at war with itself over resources that, in most centuries, were sufficient for everyone. Remain distracted produces anxiety without object, a permanent humming background dread of the modern world, the feeling that you are behind on something and you do not know what, and do not question produces the one thing that all of the others depend on, which is the absence of anyone stopping to ask what any of this is for. Fear, division, appetite, anxiety, resentment. Keller looked at the list for a long time. Then he wrote, underneath it, in handwriting that had gone very small and very careful, "We are not the workers, we are the crop. That is the claim. That is the centre of the whole thing, and it is the part that no document ever states outright, because no document has to. Once you have the 5 words, you can derive it yourself," and Keller derived it in an apartment in Sparks, alone, in April, and then he went and sat in the shower for an hour with the water running cold. According to the conspiracy, the hidden species does not eat us. It does not need our labour. It does not need our land or our metals or our water. It needs the emotional output of a large, intelligent, deeply unhappy population, and so it has spent centuries patiently, from the room beside the throne, building a civilization optimized for the mass production of exactly that. Every advertisement that makes you feel insufficient, every news broadcast that makes you afraid of your neighbour, every algorithm that has ever learned that outrage keeps you scrolling, and contentment does not. Every economic system that requires infinite growth on a finite planet, and therefore guarantees that no one, anywhere, will ever have enough. None of it is an accident, according to the theory. None of it is a bug. It is a harvest. And here is the detail that Keller could never get past, the one that would sit in his chest for the rest of his life like a stone he had swallowed. We do all of it to each other. Nobody had to make us cruel. Nobody had to teach us envy. The species did not invent human misery. It found human misery already present, in small quantities, an ordinary feature of an ordinary animal, and it did what any farmer does when they find a plant growing wild. It cultivated it. And we, in our billions, tend the fields, and we call it progress, and we are proud of the yield. Part 12. Professor Silas Whitmore. It took Keller 4 months to find the historian, and when he found him, the historian had been waiting for someone like Keller for 30 years. Silas Whitmore was 81 years old. He lived in a farmhouse outside Ithaca, New York, on 11 acres of land that had been slowly and comprehensively reclaimed by the forest. He had been, for a period of about a decade in the middle of his career, one of the most respected comparative mythologists in the English-speaking world. Then he had published a paper, and that had been the end of that. The paper was not sensational. Keller read it, all 60 pages before he ever drove east, and what struck him most was how careful it was. Whitmore made no claims. He advanced no theory. He simply laid out side by side in a series of tables that must have taken years to assemble, the mythological record of every major civilization on Earth, and he asked a question. The question was, why is it always the same story? Not similar. The same. Beings descend from the sky. This is not a European motif or an Asian motif or a Mesoamerican motif. It is all of them. It appears in cultures separated by oceans, by millennia, by every barrier that would prevent one people from borrowing an idea from another. The beings are described consistently as human in form, not monstrous, not alien, human or nearly so, and beautiful and cold. They take positions of rulership or they stand beside those who rule. They marry into royal lines. They found dynasties. The kings and pharaohs and emperors of the ancient world do not merely claim to have been appointed by these beings. They claim to be descended from them. They live a very long time. They do not, in almost any account in any culture, express what we would recognize as love. And at some point in every one of these traditions they withdraw. They go up. They go away. They become distant and inaccessible. And eventually they become gods, which is what happens to anything that stops being seen. Whitmore laid all of this out, and then, in his conclusion, he wrote one paragraph that ended his career. He wrote that scholars had spent 2 centuries explaining these parallels as archetypes, as the natural products of a shared human psychology, as the inevitable stories that a symbol-making animal will tell. And then he wrote that there was a simpler explanation, which the field had never seriously considered, and which he wished to place on the record. The simpler explanation is that they are eyewitness accounts. Keller sat with him for 6 hours in a farmhouse kitchen, with the light going gold and then orange and then gone. Whitmore made tea and did not drink it. He was thin, and his hands shook, and his mind was as sharp as a knife left in a drawer for 30 years and never once used. He said that he had been ridiculed, which he did not mind, and ignored, which he did. He said that the interesting thing about the myths is not what they contain, but where they stop. Every tradition, he said, records the arrival. Every tradition records the rule, and then every tradition records a departure, and after the departure there is nothing. The gods go away. They are silent. They no longer walk among us. And Whitmore had spent 30 years asking a question that nobody else thought was a question. Why would they leave? He set down his cup. He looked at Keller, an old man in a cold kitchen, and he said the thing he had been waiting 3 decades to say to somebody who might believe him. They did not leave. We stopped being able to see them. Part 13. The timeline. Whitmore's reconstruction, assembled over 30 years of unemployment, goes like this. They came a very long time ago, not 60 years ago, not in a flying saucer over a desert in New Mexico. Thousands of years at minimum, and Whitmore's private estimate, which he would not publish, was considerably longer. They did not come as conquerors, because they could not. Whatever brought them here, whatever it cost them, it did not leave them with an army. It left them with a small number of survivors on a planet that was already occupied by a violent, numerous, and extremely adaptable species that outnumbered them beyond any possibility of direct control. You cannot conquer a world with 100 people. It does not matter how advanced you are, but you can rule it. Because rule is not about force. Rule is about proximity to decision. So they did the only thing that was available to them, which was to become the advisors, the priests, the counsellors, the wise strangers who arrive from over the mountains and know things. They did not take the throne. They stood beside it, and they whispered, and the whispering worked, and their children whispered, and the whispering has never stopped. For most of human history, according to Whitmore, this was a stuff, and it was also all that was possible. A species of a few thousand individuals embedded across a planet of scattered agricultural populations could influence, but it could not manage. Information moved at the speed of a horse. Coordination was impossible. Control was local, partial, and constantly at risk. And then, in the space of about 200 years, we handed them everything they had ever needed. Industrialization gave them scale. It gave them corporations, which are immortal and which do not require a long-lived being to explain why the same name is on the letterhead for 2 centuries. Mass media gave them a voice that reached every ear simultaneously, and global electronic communication gave them the last piece, the one they had been waiting for, the one that Operation Beacon stumbled into in 1938 and spent 30 years learning to operate. It gave them the curtain. Whitmore said this in his kitchen, with the light gone without turning on a lamp. He said that for most of history they had to be careful. They had to stay in the shadows, in the back rooms, in the temple. They had to limit their numbers and choose their moments, and accept that they would occasionally be seen, and that when they were seen, they would have to become a myth. And then, sometime in the last 100 years, they stopped having to be careful. He said, "Think about what that means. They can stand in the street now. They can load groceries into a car in a parking lot in Nevada at 11 in the morning on a Thursday in front of 200 people, and not one of those people will see anything at all," he said. "We did not lose the ability to see them." He said, "It was taken, deliberately, by us, on their instructions, and we were so proud of the machine we built to do it that we gave it to our children as a gift." Part 14. The Resistance. They found Keller in September. He had been expecting for a year to be found by the other side. He had made peace with it in the way that you make peace with a thing you cannot prevent, which is badly and incompletely, and mostly at 3 in the morning. What he had not expected was a woman in a supermarket parking lot who fell into step beside him. matched his pace exactly, didn't look at him, and said, in a perfectly conversational voice, that Dish 4 was drifting again, and that he should really see to it before winter. Her name was Miriam Hale. She was 64 years old. She had spent 29 years as an analyst in the intelligence community, and she'd retired, officially, on medical grounds, at the age of 51. She had not been ill. She had, in the course of a routine review of long-running budgetary anomalies, found a discrepancy in an appropriations line beginning in the fiscal year 1973. She had, in other words, walked into this from the opposite end. She had started with the money. Keller had started with the picture. It had taken them both a little over a decade to arrive at the same place, which was a supermarket parking lot in Nevada in September, with the light going flat. The organisation she belonged to, if organisation is even the word, consisted of perhaps 40 people spread across 9 countries. They had no name. They had deliberately no structure, no records, and no leader, though Hale was the closest thing to one. They had been trying to expose this for 31 years. Keller asked her, in the parking lot, and then again that evening, and then again over the following months, the question that anyone would ask. Why has it not worked? The evidence exists. He had it. She had it. 40 people across 9 countries had it. Beacon's own documents were, in large part, sitting in public libraries, unclassified, uncatalogued, and unread. The frequency band could be measured by any competent engineer with the right equipment. The lenses were real. There were, Hale told him, at least 4 other pairs. Why, in 31 years had nobody believed them? And Miriam Hale gave him an answer that Keller would think about, without stopping for the rest of his life. She said, because it is not being suppressed. She said, that is what everyone gets wrong. Everyone assumes. There is a machine somewhere, hiding this, deleting the files, silencing the witnesses, and there is a little of that occasionally, and we have lost people to it, and you know that better than most. But it is not the mechanism. It is not how the secret is kept. The secret is kept, she said, because it is too large to be believed. Tell a man that his government lied about a war, and he will believe you, because it is a human-sized lie. Tell him that his government lied about a plane crash, or a chemical, or a drug, and he will believe you because he has seen those lies before. But tell a man that every institution he has ever trusted, every screen he has ever looked at, every device he has ever held, every economic principle he has organised his entire life around, is a component in a system built by a non-human species to prevent him from seeing them standing in the street. He will not investigate. He cannot. To investigate, he would first have to accept the possibility, and to accept the possibility, he would have to accept that his entire life has taken place inside a structure designed by something that does not care whether he is happy. The mind refuses, not out of cowardice, out of self-preservation. She said, the conspiracy does not need censors. She said, it is protected by the size of itself. Part 15. The Dilemma. The resistance had, over 31 years, arrived at a conclusion that had destroyed most of them. Hale told Keller about it in November, in a rented house outside Sacramento, in a room with the curtains drawn and a radio playing in the corner, which was not for atmosphere. She said that for the first 15 years they had all believed that the goal was exposure. Find the evidence, publish it, wake people up. The truth, once known, would set the world free in the way that everyone believes the truth will, because we are raised on stories in which it does. Then, sometime around year 16, someone in Prague had asked a question that nobody had ever asked. Suppose we win. Suppose tomorrow morning every human being on Earth wakes up able to see. What happens? Keller said immediately. They are removed. Hale said, from where? And she opened a laptop and she showed him what 31 years of mapping had produced, and it was the single most frightening document Adrian Keller ever saw, and there was not one alien on it. It was an org chart. It was a map of the modern world, central banks, regulatory bodies, the clearing systems through which every financial transaction on Earth passes, energy grids, food distribution networks, pharmaceutical supply chains, water treatment, the physical routing of the internet, the institutions that manage sovereign debt, the bodies that certify aircraft as safe to fly. And highlighted across all of it in a soft grey were the positions the resistance believed were held by the species. They were not at the top. They were almost never at the top. They were in the middle. They were in the joints. They were in every single place where two systems connected to each other, in the roles that nobody photographs and nobody votes for and nobody can name, the roles that exist, because a system of that size cannot function without someone who has been there for 40 years and knows how it actually works. Hale said, they are not sitting on top of civilization. She said, they are load-bearing. Remove them, and it is not a coup. It is not a revolution. There is no throne to storm, it is demolition. Every payment system on Earth fails within days, not because they sabotage it, because the people who know how to run it are gone, and nobody else does, and nobody has for 200 years. The grid destabilizes, the medicine stops moving. The food, which for most of the human population travels a very long way through a very fragile chain, stops arriving in the cities, and that is the optimistic version, which assumes that 8 billion people, having just been told the truth, behave calmly. Keller sat in that room for a long time. Then he said the thing that everyone says, at that moment, and Hale had heard it 100 times and never once been able to answer it. He said, "So we do nothing." And she said, "No." She said, "That is exactly what they are counting on you to conclude. That is the trap. It is not a coincidence that a species with no army has spent 2 centuries arranging things so that removing it would kill you. That is not an accident of history. It is the defense." Part 16. The observatory. The observatory is in New Mexico. It sits on a ridge at 8,000 feet, at the end of a road that has not been maintained in 40 years, in a place where the sky at night is so dense with stars that visitors from cities have been known to become physically unwell looking at it. It was decommissioned in 1989. The telescope was removed. The dome was sealed. The buildings were left to the weather, and the weather has taken them slowly, in the patient way that weather takes everything. There is nothing there. Anyone can drive up. People do. Hikers photograph the dome. It is on maps. Keller went up in February in the snow, with Miriam Hale and 2 other people whose names he never learned, and they did not go into the observatory. They went underneath it. The entrance is in the old generator building. It is behind a wall that is 9 inches thick, and, according to the original construction drawings, does not exist. The elevator does not work. There is a maintenance stair, and it goes down 240 feet, and Adrian Keller walked down it in the dark, in the cold, with a flashlight for 11 minutes. At the bottom there was a facility. It was not abandoned. That was the first thing. It was cold, and it was very quiet, and there was no one in it. But the air was moving, and the emergency lighting was on, and somewhere very far away something was running, and had been running for a very long time. Keller stood in a corridor 240 feet under a mountain in New Mexico, and he understood that he was inside the thing itself. What they found in that facility took 4 days to photograph and 11 months to understand, and Keller would spend the rest of his life failing to explain it to anyone in a way that captured what it was like to stand in it. But the core of it, the finding, the thing that broke him open, was in a room that was clearly a records office, in a set of files that had not been hidden at all, because there was no one down there to hide them from. The files were not a plan. They were a history, and they were not written by us. Adrian Keller had believed for 2 years that he understood what he had found. He believed he had found a predator. He believed he had found a species that had descended on a defenseless world and farmed it. What he found in that room, 240 feet underground, was the record of a people who arrived here dying. They came from somewhere else. The records do not say where, and Keller came to believe that they did not say because the writers did not want to think about it. Whatever happened, it was final, and it was total, and what reached this planet was not an expedition. It was the last of them. There were, according to the earliest census in that room, 409. 409 survivors on a world that was not theirs, breathing air that was not quite right, among a species that outnumbered them by a factor no arithmetic can make small, and for a very long time, according to those records, they did not hide. That is the part, that is the thing Keller sat down on the floor of that room to absorb. They walked among us, openly, they taught, they healed, and they were extraordinarily good at it, and we wrote it down, and we called them gods, and they let us, because it kept us calm. The early records describe something Keller could only call affection. They liked us. They found us loud and violent and astonishingly kind all at once, and they wrote about us the way you write about a species you are studying and have accidentally come to love. And then, over centuries, something changed. We grew. Their numbers stayed small, because whatever they are, they do not reproduce quickly, and there is no home to send for. Ours exploded. And a species that had once been able to guide a village found itself, over the span of a few thousand years, standing in the middle of a civilization that was accelerating past it in every direction at once. The records document the fear with excruciating clarity. There are, in that room, arguments, genuine arguments, conducted over generations, in which one faction insists that humanity must be told the truth, and the other insists that humanity, told the truth, will exterminate them within a single lifetime. And Keller read those arguments sitting on a concrete floor in the cold, and he could not honestly say that the second faction was wrong. That is the horror of it. That is the actual horror, and it is not the horror anyone expects. They looked at us. They looked at what we had done to every people who arrived on our shores looking different from us. They looked at our history, which they had watched personally in the room as it happened, and they concluded that they would not survive being seen. The second faction won. It won sometime in the early modern period, and the records mark the decision with a coldness that suggests everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. The decision was to stop being visible, and everything else, everything, the signal, the frequency, the curtain, the network, the 5 words on the billboards, the harvest, the whole terrible architecture of the modern world. All of it grew out of a single act of self-preservation by a frightened, dwindling people who had decided 4 centuries ago that the only way to survive among us was to make sure we could never look at them. And here is the thing about hiding. Hiding does not stay small. If you hide, you must control what people see. If you control what people see, you must control what people are shown. If you control what people are shown, you must control the institutions that show them things. And once you're inside those institutions, you must ensure that they never change in a way that would expose you, which means you must control the direction of an entire civilization forever in every generation without rest. They did not set out to farm us, they set out to be safe. And then they discovered, as everyone who has ever built a cage discovers, that the cage requires maintenance, and the maintenance requires power, and the power requires a population that is too frightened and too divided and too tired to look up. The last document in that room is dated 11 years before Keller found it. It is short. It is written by an individual whose name is a string of characters Keller could not pronounce, and it is, unmistakably, a private thing. Not a report, not a plan, a confession. It says that they no longer remember how to stop. It says that the system they built to protect 409 survivors now sustains itself and requires them, and that any attempt to dismantle it would kill both species at once. It says that they have become the thing they were hiding from, and it ends with a sentence that Adrian Keller carried out of that mountain and never put down. It says, "We were afraid, and we made a world out of it, and now the world is afraid, and it is ours, and we cannot give it back." Part 17. The Choice. So here is where it ends. Or rather, Here is where it does not end, which is the whole problem. Adrian Keller came up out of that mountain in February, into a sky so full of stars that it did not look like a sky at all, and he sat in a truck at 8,000 feet with the engine off, and the cold coming in through the glass, and he understood that the decision was now his. He had it all. He had the frequency, he had beacon, he had the lenses, and the org chart, and 4 days of photographs from a facility that officially does not exist, and the confession of a dying species written 11 years ago in a room under a mountain. He could publish, not to a newspaper. There were no newspapers left that were not on Hale's map, somewhere in the middle, in the joints. But there are other ways, and Keller was an engineer, and engineers know how to distribute a signal. He could put it everywhere, all of it, and it would be believed by some and mocked by more, and it would work its way outward the way these things do, slowly, incompletely, unstoppably, and somewhere in a year or a decade it would reach critical mass, and people would begin to look. And what would happen then? Best case, according to Miriam Hale, who had spent 31 years modelling it, and who said this to him in a rented house with a radio playing in the corner, a global panic, a collapse of every financial and logistical system on Earth, and a species-wide pogrom against a population of beings, most of whom have never done anything but the job in front of them, most of whom were born here, most of whom have never known any other world, and have no more choice about what they are than you have about what you are. Worst case, she said, is worse. Or, he could do nothing. He could burn the photographs and drop the lenses down a mine shaft and drive back to Nevada and fix the servo on Dish 4, which was drifting again, badly now, and would need a full replacement before spring. He could let the world go on, fed and lit and connected and comfortable and afraid, governed from the room beside the throne by frightened refugees who cannot stop, and people would live and die and never know, the way they have lived and died and never known for 400 years, and the harvest would continue, and children would be born into it, and they would call it life, because it is the only life there is. Keller sat in the truck at 8,000 feet. There was no third option. That is what he kept looking for, and what he could not find, and what nobody in 31 years had ever found, and what you will not find either, though you will try in a few minutes, when the room is dark and this voice has stopped, and you are lying there with your eyes closed and your mind going in circles. Expose it, and you kill the world to free it. Preserve it, and you keep the world alive inside a lie. He never told anyone what he chose. That is the last verified fact in this story. Adrian Keller drove down off that ridge on a Tuesday morning in February, and he was seen at a gas station in Socorro at 9 in the morning, and after that, the record ends. He did not return to the shed. His apartment in Sparks was found. 11 days later, when the rent went unpaid, his coat was on the hook. His keys were in the bowl by the door. There was a mug in the sink, and his laptop was on the kitchen table, open, plugged in, screen dark, and every sector of it overwritten, returned with considerable effort and considerable expense to the exact condition it had been in on the day it left the factory. Whether he did that himself, we do not know. We know only that there was no note this time. 9 words in blue ink, and then nothing at all. Reflection. Now. Before you go, let me say the only honest thing there is to say about a story like this one, which is that it is a story. There is no Adrian Keller. There is no Operation Beacon, no bunker in Arizona, no facility under an observatory in New Mexico. Nobody in 1938 recorded a transmission from the Arctic that has been hiding underneath every broadcast in the world ever since. You may sleep on that if it helps, and I hope it does. But I want to leave you with the reason a story like this works. Because it does work. It has kept you here, all this way, and it will follow you a little way into the dark, and it is worth understanding why. It works because you already knew, not about them, there is no them, but about the shape of it. You already knew that a great deal of what you look at every day is engineered to make you feel insufficient. You already knew that the news is built to frighten you, and that the frightening works better than the truth. You already knew that somewhere, in a building you will never enter, somebody has run the numbers and discovered that your dissatisfaction is more valuable than your peace. You knew that. Everyone knows that. It is not hidden. It has never been hidden. It is printed in the annual reports of publicly traded companies. And that is the actual quiet, unbearable thing at the bottom of this story, and it is not about aliens. It is that you do not need a hidden species to explain the world you live in. We built the machine. We are still building it. There is no curtain and no lens and no frequency, and the billboards do not say obey, and they do not have to, because they have found something that works better than obey. And in the story, at the end, in a room under a mountain, a dying people writes a confession that says, "We were afraid, and we made a world out of it." Which is not, if you think about it, a sentence about aliens at all. So here is the question, and then I will let you sleep, and I want you to take it down with you into that quiet place where the thinking goes soft at the edges and stops being thinking and becomes something else. Adrian Keller sat in a truck at 8,000 feet and could not find a third option. But he was looking for a way to take something apart. And the thing is, the machine we actually live inside, the real one, the one with no aliens in it, does not have to be taken apart at all. It only has to be looked at. That is the whole trick. That is the only lens there has ever been. Not glass. Attention. The simple, ordinary, entirely available act of stopping for one moment in front of the thing that is trying to make you afraid and asking who benefits. Nobody has to hide anything from you. They only have to keep you moving too fast to notice. And you're not moving fast right now. You're lying still in the dark with the day behind you and nothing being asked of you at all. And the machine, whatever it is, does not have you. Not here, not now, not tonight. So let it go. Let the frequency hum on out there without you. Let the billboards say whatever they say to an empty street. Let the whole vast humming architecture of everything run on, all night, without your attention, without your fear, without your participation. You're allowed to put it down. You have been carrying it all day, and you are allowed to put it down. And when you wake, the world will still be there, and it will still be strange, and you will still be the one thing in it that gets to decide what you look at. But that is tomorrow. For tonight, there is nothing left to see.